The wind in Blackwood was not merely a weather pattern, it was a resident. It lived in the gaps between the rough-hewn pine planks of the buildings, whistled through the spokes of wagon wheels, and carried the grit of the high plains into every cup of coffee and every crease of clothing. The town sat exposed on the lip of the territory, a half-finished thought of civilization dropped onto a landscape that did not want it there. To the west, the mountains rose up like a bruise on the horizon, blue-gray and jagged, indifferent to the small, struggling lives playing out in their shadow. To the east, the prairie stretched out flat and brown, a sea of dead grass that hissed when the wind blew. It was late autumn in the year 1889, and the season hung suspended between the dry heat of a brutal summer and the killing freeze of the winter to come. The sky was a hard, pale slate, offering no warmth. In the smallest house at the northern edge of town, Lena Hart woke before the sun. The room was freezing. The fire in the cast-iron stove had died hours ago, leaving the air sharp enough to sting the lungs. Lena lay still for a moment under the thin weight of her quilt, listening to the house settle. She was 28 years old, but in the gray light of dawn, she felt ancient. Her bones ached with a deep, pervasive chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She sat up and swung her legs over the side of the narrow bed. Her feet found the wooden floorboards, and she suppressed a shiver. There was no time for self-pity. There was only the routine that kept her moving, the mindless mechanics of survival. Lena dressed quickly in the semi-darkness, pulling on a heavy wool skirt that had been mended 3 times at the hem and a bodice that was growing too loose around her ribs. She braided her dark hair with fingers that were red and cracked from lye soap and cold water. She avoided looking at the small, foggy mirror above the wash basin. She knew what she would see: dark circles like bruises under eyes that were too wide, a mouth drawn tight by silence, and the ghost of a woman who used to smile. She moved to the kitchen, the main room of the small shack. The wood box was nearly empty. She counted the sticks. 4, enough to boil water for tea and maybe warm the room for an hour. After that, she would have to go out. She lit the stove with a careful hand, nursing the flame. As the water heated, she stood by the window that faced the main road, but she stood back, pressed against the wall where she could see out but could not be seen. The town was waking up. A few men were heading toward the livery stable, their breath puffing in white clouds. A freight wagon rattled past, its wheels churning the half-frozen mud of the street. Lena watched them with a mix of envy and fear. They belonged. They had a place in the rhythm of Blackwood. She was an anomaly. She was the widow Hart, the woman who lived at the edge of town in the house her husband had died in. The woman the town whispered about when they thought she wasn't listening. And sometimes, when they knew she was, she drank her tea black. There was no sugar, and the milk had soured 2 days ago. It was bitter, but the heat spread through her chest, giving her enough courage to face the door. She had work to sell. Over the last week, staying up until her eyes burned in the candlelight. She had embroidered 3 handkerchiefs with delicate violet flowers, and she had mended 2 work shirts for the sprawling ranch south of town. It wasn't much, but it might be enough for a sack of flour and a tin of lamp oil. Lena wrapped her frayed gray shawl around her shoulders, pinned it tight at her throat, and picked up her basket. She took a breath, holding it for a second, then opened the door and stepped out into the wind. The walk to the center of Blackwood was less than a mile, but it felt like running a gauntlet. The main street was lined with false front buildings that leaned slightly, as if tired of standing against the gales. The boardwalks were uneven, the wood gray and splintered. Lena kept her head down, watching her boots step over the ruts. She sensed the eyes before she saw them. 2 women stood outside the millinery shop, their bonnets bobbing as they spoke. Mrs. Gable and Mrs. Vance, pillars of the church, guardians of the town's morality. As Lena approached, their conversation died abruptly. The silence was louder than the wind. Lena tightened her grip on her basket. "Good morning, Mrs. Gable, Mrs. Vance," Lena said, her voice sounding thin to her own ears. "Mrs." Gable offered a stiff nod. Her lips pressed into a line so thin it disappeared. Morning, Mrs. Hart. They watched her pass. Lena could feel their gazes sticking to her back like burrs. She had only gone 3 steps past them when the whispering started, loud enough to carry on the breeze. "Look at that hem, Mrs." Vance hissed. "Dragging in the mud." You would think she had no pride left. Pride is a luxury for the guilty. "Mrs.," Gable replied, her voice dripping with righteous pity. "It is a wonder she can show her face at all, after what that poor man endured." Lena did not stumble, though her knees felt like water. She fixed her eyes on the sign for Crow's General Mercantile and kept walking. Poor man. That was what Silas had become in death. A martyr. A saint who had taken in a quiet girl and been repaid with tragedy. The town had forgotten the bruises Lena used to hide with high collars. They had forgotten the days she didn't come to town at all because she couldn't walk without limping. They remembered only the charming Sheriff Hart, who bought rounds at the saloon and tipped his hat to the ladies. She reached the Mercantile and pushed the heavy door open. A bell jingled overhead, a cheerful sound that made her flinch. The store was warm, smelling of roasted coffee beans, cured leather, and sawdust. It was a smell of abundance, of normal life. Elias Crow stood behind the long polished counter, weighing a bag of nails for a ranch hand. Crow was a man in his 50s, with silver hair slicked back with oil and a suit that was always pressed. He was the wealthiest man in Blackwood. A church elder and the holder of the mortgage on Lena's house, he finished with the ranch hand, who tipped his hat to Lena and hurried out. The door clicked shut, leaving them alone. "Mrs. Hart," Crow said. His voice was smooth, like oil pouring over gravel. He wiped his hands on a rag and leaned on the counter. "We did not expect to see you today. I brought the mending, Mr. Crow," Lena said, placing the basket on the counter. "And the embroidery?" Crow reached out and picked up one of the handkerchiefs. He examined it with slow, deliberate movements, turning it over to check the stitching. His fingers were thick, with manicured nails. "Fine work, as always." He said, "But the market for luxuries is slim this time of year. Lena, the ranchers are tightening their belts for winter. I need flour," Lena said, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice. "And oil." Crow sighed, a sound of exaggerated regret. He placed the handkerchief back in the basket. "I can give you store credit, of course, but we must discuss the other matter. The first of the month has passed." "I know," Lena said. "I just need a little more time." The winter is hard on everyone," Crow interrupted softly. He leaned closer, his eyes pale blue and utterly cold. "I have been very patient. Lena, most men would have evicted you months ago. The bank would have taken the deed the day after the funeral." "I am trying," Lena whispered. Crow smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I know you are. And I want to help you. I have told you before. I would be happy to take the house off your hands. It is falling down around your ears anyway. I would give you a fair price, enough to move on. Perhaps back east or somewhere else." "I have nowhere else to go," Lena said. "That house is all I have." Crow's gaze dropped from her eyes to her throat, then lower, lingering in a way that made Lena's skin crawl. "You are a young woman. Lena, you should not be buried alive in that shack. There are other ways to pay debts, other arrangements that could be made for a woman alone." The implication hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Lena felt a flush of shame burn her cheeks. She understood exactly what he was offering, and exactly what it would cost. "I will have the money next month," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Just take the mending, please." Crow stared at her for a long moment, his smile fading into a look of irritation. Very well. He tallied the value of the items in a ledger, scratching the pen across the paper with aggressive strokes. He gathered a small sack of flour and a bottle of oil and pushed them across the counter. "It is not enough to cover the interest." "Lena," he said, his voice dropping to a warning tone, "do not test my charity forever. Even Christian kindness has its limits." "Thank you," Lena mumbled. She grabbed the items and fled the store, the bell jingling mockingly behind her. The walk home was a blur. The wind had picked up, tearing at her shawl, stinging her eyes with dust. She didn't look at anyone. She just walked, clutching the flower to her chest like a shield, back in the safety of her house. She bolted the door and leaned against it, breathing hard. The silence of the house rushed in to meet her, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with him. She moved to the kitchen table and set down the flower. Her eyes drifted, against her will, to the narrow staircase that led to the loft bedroom. The wood on the third step was splintered. Flashback. It was 6 months ago. The storm had been raging outside, thunder shaking the very foundation of the house. Silas had come home late, stumbling, his badge pinned crookedly to his vest. He smelled of whiskey and stale smoke. "Where is my supper?" he had roared. His voice slurred. "It is cold." "Silas," Lena had said, shrinking back against the stove. "You said you would be home at 6. Don't you talk back to me. Woman," he had snarled. He crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbing her by the upper arm. His fingers dug in, bruising the flesh instantly. "You are ungrateful. That is what you are. A sullen, ungrateful bitch." He had dragged her toward the stairs. "I will teach you some respect." Lena had fought him. She had never fought him before, usually just curling into a ball and waiting for it to be over. But that night, something had snapped. She was tired of the fear. She was tired of the pain. "No," she had screamed. She had shoved him. It wasn't a calculated move. It was a blind, frantic push with both hands against his chest. Silas had been off balance, the whiskey stealing his coordination. He stumbled back. His heel caught the edge of the rug. He went down backward, hard. His head struck the edge of the third step with a sickening crack that sounded like a branch snapping in winter. He slid to the bottom and lay still. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, glassy and surprised. Lena had stood there for an hour, shaking, waiting for him to get up and kill her, but he never moved. End flashback. Lena squeezed her eyes shut, pressing the heels of her hands into her sockets. The town whispered that she had murdered him, that she had poisoned him, or pushed him, or bewitched him. The coroner had called it an accidental fall. Sheriff Hart had been drunk. Everyone knew he liked to drink, though they never spoke of it now. But Lena knew the truth. She had put her hands on him. She had wanted him to stop. In that split second before he fell, she had hated him with a force that felt like sin. Did that make her a killer? She looked at her hands. They were trembling. "I don't know," she whispered to the empty room. "I don't know if I'm sorry." The guilt was a cold stone in her stomach. Not guilt for his death, but guilt for her relief. The mornings were quiet now. There were no heavy footsteps to fear. But the price of that silence was the crushing weight of isolation and the feeling that she was damned. The sun began to dip toward the mountains, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red. The wind did not die down. It sharpened, carrying the promise of a freezing night. At the south end of town, a rider appeared on the crest of the hill. He rode a bay horse that was caked in the dust of 3 territories. The animal's head hung low, tired, but its gait was steady. Caleb Ryder sat deep in the saddle, moving with the rhythm of the horse. He was a man who looked like he had been carved out of the landscape itself, rough, weathered, and enduring. He wore a canvas coat that had once been tan but was now the color of dirt, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. A Winchester rifle sat in the scabbard under his leg, the stock worn smooth by handling. He rode slowly down the main street of Blackwood. His face was a map of hard years. A thin white scar ran from his left cheekbone down to his jaw, disappearing into the stubble of a beard. His eyes were dark, watchful, scanning the street with the habit of a man who expects trouble. He didn't look at the people on the boardwalks, but he saw them. He saw the way they paused to assess him, checking the brand on his horse, the gun at his hip, the lack of a badge. He was a drifter, and in a town like this, a drifter was either a customer or a threat. Caleb pulled up in front of the Silver Dollar Saloon. He swung down from the saddle, his boots hitting the frozen mud with a heavy thud. He patted the bay's neck. "Rest easy, boy," he murmured. His voice was gravel, unused to long sentences. He tied the reins to the hitching rail and stepped inside. The saloon was warm, thick with the smell of stale beer and unwashed bodies. A dozen men were scattered around, some at tables playing cards, others leaning against the bar. The conversation lulled as Caleb entered, then picked up again in a lower register. Caleb walked to the bar, his spurs chiming softly. "Whiskey," he said, "and information about work." The barkeep, a man with a handlebar mustache and a stained apron, poured a glass of amber liquid. "That depends on what you can do." "Stranger, I can ride," Caleb said. "I can handle stock. I can fix what's broken. Ranch work is slow right now." The barkeep said, "Most spreads are laying men off for winter, but you might try the livery or hauling freight for Crow." Caleb nodded and took a sip of the whiskey. It burned, going down. A welcome fire. At a table near the door, 3 men were laughing loudly. They were young, rough-looking types, stable hands or drift riders with money burning holes in their pockets. "I am telling you," one of them said, slamming his hand on the table. "I saw her today, walking like she is the Queen of Sheba." "You would think a woman who drove her husband to the grave would have the decency to look ashamed." "The widow Hart?" another man sneered. "She is not ashamed. She is probably looking for the next one. Though who would take her? She is cursed, or crazy. Crazy like a fox," the first man said. "She got rid of the sheriff, didn't she? Now she sits in that house all alone. I bet she gets lonely. Maybe she needs some company to warm her up." They laughed, a low, ugly sound that made Caleb's hand tighten around his glass. He didn't know who they were talking about. He didn't know this widow Hart, but he knew the tone. It was the sound of wolves circling a lame calf. It was the sound of cruelty masquerading as sport. Caleb stared into the mirror behind the bar. He saw his own reflection, the scar, the tired eyes. He had seen enough violence in his life to fill a graveyard. He had ridden with rough men, and he had done things he wasn't proud of to survive, but he had never stomached a bully. He finished his whiskey in one swallow and set the glass down. He didn't say a word. It wasn't his town, and it wasn't his fight, but the taste of the whiskey had turned sour in his mouth. Night fell over Blackwood like a heavy blanket. The temperature plummeted. The puddles in the street froze into jagged mirrors. In her house, Lena paced. The silence was unbearable tonight. The encounter with Crow, the whispers of the women, the memories of Silas. It all swirled in her head until she felt like she couldn't breathe. The walls felt like they were closing in. She needed to get out. She needed to speak to him, to make sure he was really dead, or perhaps to beg him to stop haunting her. She grabbed her shawl and wrapped it twice around her head and shoulders. She slipped out the back door, moving like a ghost toward the hill that rose behind the town. The cemetery was a bleak patch of ground enclosed by a falling-down picket fence. The wooden crosses were crooked, beaten by the wind. There were only a few headstones. Stone was expensive to haul this far west. Lena found Silas's grave. It was marked by a simple wooden cross. The name burned into the wood. The earth was still mounded slightly, the grass struggling to take root. She knelt in the dirt. The cold seeped instantly through her skirt, freezing her knees. The wind whipped her shawl, trying to tear it away. "Silas," she whispered. There was no answer, only the wind hissing through the dead weeds. "I went to the store today," she said, her voice trembling. "Crow wants the house. Everyone hates me. They look at me like I am a monster." She bowed her head, tears leaking from her eyes. They froze on her cheeks, stinging like cuts. "I tried to be a good wife," she sobbed. "I tried so hard, but you wouldn't stop." "Why wouldn't you stop?" She gripped the rough wood of the cross. "I am glad you are gone," she confessed. The words ripped out of her, raw and bleeding. She clamped a hand over her mouth, terrified. She expected lightning. She expected the ground to open up, but nothing happened. The silence persisted. "I am relieved," she whispered through her fingers. "And I hate myself for it. I feel filthy. I don't know how to live like this. She looked up at the indifferent stars. "I don't want to be alone," she said to the sky. "But I don't deserve anything else." She stayed there until her hands were numb, punishing herself with the cold. Finally, shivering violently, she forced herself to stand. She turned and began the walk back down the hill toward the lights of the town. Her path took her past the back of the livery stable, a sprawling structure of dark wood. The smell of horses and hay hung in the air. As she passed the corner of the corral, shadows detached themselves from the fence. 3 men. They smelled of cheap whiskey and sweat. "Well now, look what the wind blew in," a voice slurred. Lena froze. It was the men from the saloon. The one who spoke was tall and lanky, with a gap-toothed grin. "It is the widow," another said, stepping behind her to cut off her retreat. "Out for a midnight stroll? Visiting the hubby?" "Let me pass," Lena said, her voice shaking. "Now." "Don't be rude," the tall one said. He stepped closer, invading her space. "We were just talking about you, darling, thinking you must be awful cold in that big empty house." He reached out and grabbed her arm. His fingers were rough, digging into her flesh through the wool of her shawl. "Let go of me," Lena cried, pulling back. "She is a feisty one." The third man laughed. Maybe that is why Silas had to smack her around, had to tame her. Lena's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The mention of Silas, the grip on her arm. It was the nightmare made flesh. This was it. This was her punishment for being glad he was dead. She opened her mouth to scream, but the fear choked her. It came out as a ragged gasp. The tall man reached out with his other hand and tipped her chin up, forcing her to look at him. His eyes were glassy and cruel. "You are too pretty to be a murderer," he whispered. "Why don't you show us how nice you can be? Please," Lena whimpered. "Please don't." One of the men grabbed her other arm. They were pinning her against the corral fence. The rough wood bit into her back. The world narrowed to the smell of alcohol and the terrifying heat of their bodies. "Hey!" The voice cut through the wind like a whip crack. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that froze the men in place. They turned. Caleb Ryder stepped out of the shadows of the livery barn. He had been bedding down his horse, intending to sleep in the hay to save money. He held a pitchfork in one hand, but he let it drop. Leaning it against the barn wall, he walked toward them, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Let the lady go," Caleb said. His voice was calm, almost conversational, but his hands were loose at his sides. "Ready," the tall man sneered, though he didn't let go of Lena. "Who are you? This is none of your business. Drifter." "Walk away," I said. "Let her go." Caleb stopped 5 feet from them. The tall man shoved Lena hard against the fence. "Stay there," he growled at her. He turned to face Caleb, puffing out his chest. "You want trouble? Scarface? You found it." He lunged at Caleb, swinging a wild, looping punch. Caleb didn't flinch. He stepped inside the swing with practiced ease, blocking the arm with his left forearm and driving his right fist into the man's solar plexus. The man doubled over with a wheeze, the air driven from his lungs. Caleb followed up with a sharp elbow to the back of the neck, sending the man face first into the dirt. The other 2 men hesitated, stunned by the speed of the violence. "Get him!" one shouted, reaching for a knife at his belt. Caleb moved. He kicked the knife hand before the blade cleared the sheath. The man howled, clutching his wrist. Caleb grabbed him by the collar and the belt, swinging him around and throwing him into the water trough. The ice broke with a crash, and the man sputtered, thrashing in the freezing water. The third man, seeing his friends decimated in seconds, fumbled for a pistol in his coat pocket. "Don't," Caleb warned. His voice dropped an octave. The man froze, the gun half drawn. He looked at Caleb's eyes. They were dark, devoid of fear, and promising absolute destruction. The man swallowed hard. He shoved the gun back into his pocket. You will regret this," he stammered. "Take your friends and go," Caleb said. The man in the dirt groaned and staggered to his feet, clutching his stomach. The one in the trough scrambled out, dripping and shivering. They glared at Caleb with hatred, muttering curses, but they backed away. You are a dead man, the tall one spat. They turned and stumbled off into the darkness, their boots scuffing on the frozen ground. Caleb watched them go until they disappeared around the corner. Only then did he let the tension drain from his shoulders. He turned toward the fence. Lena was pressed against the wood. Her knees buckled, sliding down toward the ground. She was shaking so violently, her teeth chattered audibly. Her shawl had slipped down, exposing her neck to the biting wind. Caleb approached her slowly, hands visible, palms open. "Ma'am," he said gently, "they are gone." Lena couldn't speak. She was gasping for air, her chest heaving. The tears that had started at the grave were flowing freely now, hot tracks on her frozen skin. Caleb saw the terror in her eyes. He saw the way she flinched when he stepped closer. He stopped, keeping a respectful distance. He unbuttoned his canvas coat and took it off. The cold hit him through his flannel shirt, but he ignored it. He stepped forward and draped the heavy coat over her shoulders. "Here," he said. "It is not much, but it is warm." The weight of the coat settled on her. It smelled of horse, tobacco, and clean sweat. It smelled of safety. Lena grabbed the lapels with numb fingers, pulling it tight around her. She looked up at him. In the moonlight, his scar looked stark, a jagged line across his face, but his eyes were not cruel. They were filled with a quiet, weary concern. He wasn't from here. He didn't know her shame. He hadn't asked if she deserved it. He had just stopped it. The adrenaline crashed out of her, leaving her hollow and defenseless. The reality of the empty house waiting for her, the dark walk, the endless nights of fear, it all rose up like a tide. Lena started, her voice cracking. She looked at this stranger, this dangerous man who had saved her. She saw the hesitation in him, the way he was ready to walk away if she told him to. "I don't want to be alone tonight," she gasped. The words spilled out before she could check them. It was a plea, naked and desperate. It was the truth she had whispered to the grave, now spoken to a living man. Caleb went still. He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the widow's weeds, the poverty in her mended clothes, the terror that went deeper than just a scuffle with drunks. He knew what the town would say if he was seen with her. He knew he should get on his horse and ride, but he remembered the sound of the men in the saloon. He remembered the feeling of being hunted. He nodded, a slow, solemn movement. "Can you walk?" he asked. Lena nodded, wiping her face with the sleeve of his coat. "Yes, come on then," Caleb said. "I will walk you home." He didn't offer his arm. He sensed she couldn't handle being touched right now. He stood beside her, a solid wall against the wind. "Where do you live?" he asked. "The last house," Lena whispered. "At the edge of town." Caleb adjusted his hat. "Lead the way, ma'am." They began to walk. The wind howled around them, kicking up dust, but the silence between them was heavy and thick. It wasn't the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of a pact made in the dark, a fragile agreement between two broken people trying to survive the night. The door to Lena's house rattled in its frame as Caleb pushed it shut against the wind. The silence that followed was abrupt and heavy, a stark contrast to the howling chaos outside. The darkness inside was total, save for the faint gray rectangle of the frosted window. The air here was colder than the street, a stillness that seeped into the marrow. "Stay there," Caleb said, his voice low in the dark. "I will strike a light." Lena stood by the door, shivering beneath the weight of his heavy canvas coat. She heard the scuff of his boots on the floorboards, the distinct scrape of a match against a rough surface. And then, a sudden flare of yellow light. The smell of sulfur and burning cedar filled the small room. Caleb cupped the flame to the wick of a kerosene lamp on the table. The light bloomed, casting long, jumping shadows against the walls. He turned to look at her. The house was terrified in its sparsity. There was a table with two mismatched chairs, a stove that looked cold as a tombstone, and a narrow shelf with a few plates. The floor was swept clean, not a speck of dust, but the neatness only highlighted the poverty. It was a house stripped of comfort, holding its breath. "Let us get that stove going," Caleb said. He moved with a heavy grace, his spurs clinking softly. He knelt before the iron stove. Opening the grate, he found the wood box and frowned at the few meager sticks remaining. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small penknife, shaving kindling from one of the logs with precise, practiced movements. Lena watched him, unable to move. Her body was still vibrating with the aftershocks of the attack. She watched his hands, large, scarred, covered in the grime of the trail, handling the wood with a strange delicacy. Within minutes, a fire was crackling. The sound was the most comforting thing Lena had heard in months. Caleb stood up, dusting his hands on his trousers. "Sit down, ma'am," he said, "before you fall down." Lena moved to the table and sank into one of the chairs. She pulled his coat tighter around her, burying her nose in the collar. It smelled of horse sweat, tobacco, and rain. A scent so masculine and grounded it made her head spin. Caleb found the kettle and the water bucket. He didn't ask where things were. He just looked until he found them, moving through her kitchen as if he had a right to be there. He set the water to boil and then turned to face her. He took off his hat, revealing hair flattened by the brim, dark and shaggy. "I am Caleb Ryder," he said. "I am Lena." She whispered, "Lena Hart." "I know," he said. He didn't say how he knew. He didn't mention the men in the saloon or the whispers on the street. He pulled the other chair out and sat opposite her, keeping the table between them like a shield. The kettle began to sing. Caleb rose to pour the water into 2 chipped mugs he found on the shelf. He set one in front of her. "Wrap your hands around that," he instructed. Lena did. The heat seared her palms, painful and good. She stared into the dark liquid. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible. For stopping them." Caleb took a sip of his own water. There was no tea left in the jar, though he didn't comment on it. "Men like that are like coyotes," he said. "They only bite when they outnumber you." "Why did you help me?" Lena asked. She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and searching. "Everyone else just looks away. Or they watch." Caleb ran a thumb along the rim of his mug. His knuckles were swollen and red from the fight. "I don't hold with hurting women," he said simply. "Doesn't matter who they are, or what people say they are." Lena flinched. "You heard them. Then, what they say?" Caleb looked at the candle flame flickering between them. "I heard talk. Words are cheap. They say I killed him," Lena blurted out. The words came rushing up from her chest. "Unbidden. They say I am cursed, that I drove him to it because I was cold, because I didn't make him happy." She stopped, horrified. Why was she telling him this? He was a drifter, a stranger with a gun and a scar that looked like it had been carved by a knife. But the silence in the room wasn't judging her. It was just waiting. "He was the sheriff," she continued, speaking to the table. "He was a hero to them. They didn't see him when the door was closed. They didn't see the way he would change when the whiskey took him." She took a shaky breath. "I used to hide the bruises with flour," she said. "If you pack it on thick enough, it looks like pale skin." Caleb remained motionless. He didn't look away, and he didn't offer empty pity. He just listened, his dark eyes fixed on her face, witnessing her confession. "Tonight," Lena whispered, tears leaking from her eyes again. "At the grave, I told him I was glad he was dead. That is why those men found me. I was out there telling a dead man that I was happy he was rotting." She covered her face with her hands. "I am going to hell. I know I am." Caleb set his mug down with a soft thud. "I have seen hell, Mrs. Hart," he said quietly. "It is not a woman standing over a grave telling the truth." Lena lowered her hands. "Hell is a canyon in Arizona with no water and Apache waiting in the rocks," Caleb said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Hell is a barn burning with horses inside it. Hell is what you carry when you have done things you can't undo. Being relieved that your pain is over, that is not hell. That is just survival." Lena stared at him. He spoke of violence as if it were a neighbor he knew well. "You have done things?" she asked. "Things you can't undo?" Caleb looked down at his hands. He flexed his right hand, wincing slightly as the bruised skin tightened. "I have," he said. "I rode for a rancher down in the New Mexico territory. It was a range war, barbed wire and water rights. We did what we were paid to do. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The set of his jaw and the shadow in his eyes told the story of gunfire and empty saddles. "Why did you leave?" Lena asked. Caleb shrugged, a small movement of one shoulder. "I got tired of being the one they pointed at when things went wrong. A man gets a reputation, and pretty soon the reputation walks into the room 5 minutes before he does. I thought maybe up here, the air might be cleaner." He looked around the meager kitchen. "Seems the wind blows just as dirty here, though." A silence fell between them. But it wasn't the terrified silence of before. It was a shared quiet, a recognition of matching scars. Lena felt a strange sensation in her chest, a loosening of the knot that had been tied there for months. He was dangerous, yes, but he was dangerous to the world, not to her. The heat of the stove began to fill the room, warring with the drafts. Lena's eyelids felt heavy, weighted with the exhaustion of adrenaline leaving her body. She took a sip of the hot water, pretending it was tea. "You should go," she murmured, her head drooping. "If they find you here, let them find me." Caleb said, "I am not leaving you alone in this house tonight, not with that door latch as flimsy as it is. I have no money to pay you," Lena said drowsily. "I didn't ask for money," Caleb replied. Lena rested her cheek against her hand. Her eyes drifted shut. The candle flame danced behind her eyelids. She meant to stay awake. She meant to keep watch. But the warmth of the stove and the steady, rhythmic breathing of the man across the table pulled her down. For the first time in a year, she wasn't listening for the sound of boots on the stairs. She fell asleep, slumped in the chair, her breathing evening out into a soft rhythm. Caleb watched her for a long time, in sleep. The lines of worry on her forehead smoothed out. She looked younger, softer, and heartbreakingly fragile. She was like a bird that had been beaten against a window pane until it stopped trying to fly. He stood up slowly, careful not to scrape his chair. He walked around the table and looked down at her. He didn't know what he was doing. He was a man who moved on. That was his rule. You stop, you get trapped, you die. But he couldn't leave her in the chair. He bent down and slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back. She stirred slightly but didn't wake. She was light, too light. It made anger flare in his gut again. Anger at the town, at the dead husband, at the God who let this happen. He carried her to the narrow bed in the corner of the room. He laid her down as if she were made of glass. He pulled the patchwork quilt up to her chin, tucking it in around her shoulders. He stood there for a moment, his hand hovering near her hair, then pulled it back. He turned away and blew out the candle. Caleb didn't take the other chair. He grabbed his bedroll from the corner where he'd dropped it, unrolled it by the stove, and sat with his back against the wall. He tipped his hat forward over his eyes, crossed his arms, and rested his hand on the butt of the Colt revolver at his hip. He listened to the wind rattling the bones of the house, and he waited for the dawn. Morning arrived not with sunlight, but with a shift in the grayness. The wind had died down, leaving a heavy, sullen silence over the plains. Lena woke with a start. For a second, she didn't know where she was. She was warm. She was in her bed. Then the memory of the night rushed back, the cemetery, the men, the fight. She sat up, clutching the quilt. Caleb was sitting on the floor by the stove. He was awake, holding a cup of coffee. He had evidently found her hidden stash of beans and kindled the fire again. "Morning," he said. His voice was rough with sleep and morning air. Lena stared at him, her hair messy, her cheeks flushed with sleep. "Morning," she stammered. She felt a sudden, hot wave of embarrassment. A man was in her house, a man she barely knew, and yet, beneath the shame, there was a profound sense of relief that the house wasn't empty. "I used the last of your coffee," Caleb said. Standing up, he stretched, his joints popping audibly. "I will replace it." "You don't have to," Lena said. You stayed. I said I would." He walked to the window and peered out through the frost that ferned the glass. "The town is waking up. I best be moving before the tongues start wagging harder than they already are." Lena threw her legs over the side of the bed, smoothing her skirt. She felt exposed, yet she didn't want him to go. "Where will you go?" she asked. "Livery," Caleb said. "Going to see if that Smith needs an extra hand? Or maybe the freight office?" He picked up his hat from the table and settled it on his head. He looked at her one last time, his eyes lingering on her face. "Lock the door behind me, Lena." "I will," she said. He opened the door and stepped out into the biting cold. Lena ran to the window. She rubbed a circle in the frost and watched him walk away. He walked with a long, loping stride, his head down against the chill. He looked solitary and unbreakable against the gray morning. A sharp ache bloomed in her chest. It wasn't love. She didn't know him well enough for love. It was the ache of a starving person seeing a feast pulled away. The town of Blackwood did not need a telegraph wire to spread news. It had the church ladies. By 10 o'clock, the story had mutated 3 times. First, Caleb had been seen leaving Lena's house. Then, he had been seen entering it at midnight. By noon, Mrs. Vance was telling the postmaster that Lena had been seen dancing in the street with a gunman while her husband's grave was still fresh. Lena went to the well to draw water and felt the atmosphere shift. It was no longer just disdain. It was active hostility. Men stopped talking when she passed, their eyes hard and speculative. Women gathered her skirts and crossed the muddy street to avoid her. She entertained him. She heard a woman whisper near the dry goods store, "All night, can you imagine?" And him a killer. Another replied, "Birds of a feather." Lena kept her head high, her jaw set, but inside, she was trembling. She hurried back to her house and bolted the door. Caleb found work. It wasn't charity. It was necessity. The livery owner. A man named Silas. No, not Silas. Lena's husband was Silas. The livery owner was a gruff German named Miller. He had seen Caleb handle the drunks the night before. "You treat the horses better than you treat the men, yeah?" Miller had grunted. "Better class of people, horses." Caleb had replied. Miller hired him to break a string of wild mustangs brought in from the basin. It was brutal, bone-jarring work. Caleb spent his days covered in dust, sweat, and horsehair. He was thrown twice, stomped on, and bitten. But by the end of the week, the horses were rideable. He took his pay in coin and credit, and then he went to Lena's. He didn't knock on the front door. He went to the side of the house where the storm shutter hung by one rusted hinge. He brought tools he had borrowed from Miller. Lena heard the banging and came out, wiping her hands on her apron. "What are you doing?" she asked, shielding her eyes from the glare of the winter sun. "Fixing this shutter," Caleb said around a mouthful of nails. "Before the next wind blows it through your window. I can't pay you." "Caleb, you gave me coffee," he said, hammering a nail home with a single, decisive blow. "We are square." It became a pattern. He would work at the livery or haul freight for the mercantile, ignoring Crow's icy glares, and, in the late afternoons, he would drift to Lena's house. He fixed the sagging fence that had let the neighbor's goats into her garden. He patched the leak in the roof that dripped onto her pillow. He chopped a cord of wood and stacked it high against the wall. He never came inside unless invited, and even then, he stayed near the door. He was careful. He knew the town was watching. He knew he was walking a line as thin as a razor, but the distance between them began to shrink. One afternoon, Lena brought him a cup of fresh coffee while he was mending the front step. He was kneeling, his shirt sleeves rolled up despite the cold, exposing the roped muscles of his forearms. She held the cup out. Her fingers brushed his as he took it. The contact was electric. Lena pulled her hand back as if burned. Caleb went still, his eyes snapping to hers. For a second, the air was charged with something that wasn't gratitude and wasn't friendship. "Thank you," he muttered, looking back at the wood. Another day. He was struggling with a stubborn, rusted nail in the door frame. He wrenched it with the claw of the hammer, and the metal snapped. The hammer slipped and banged his thumb against the jamb. "Damn it to hell," Caleb hissed, dropping the hammer and shaking his hand. Lena, who was sweeping the porch, froze. Then, a sound bubbled up from her throat, a giggle, then a laugh, a real, rusty, unpracticed laugh. Caleb looked at her, nursing his thumb, his face thunderous. Then, seeing her eyes crinkled at the corners, the anger drained out of him. A sheepish grin tugged at the corner of his mouth. "It is not funny," he grumbled. "It is a little funny," Lena said, covering her mouth. "You, the big scary gunman, defeated by a nail." Caleb chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. I reckon the nail had the high ground. The sound of their laughter drifted out into the street, a defiant note against the gray silence of the town. The weather turned 2 weeks later. The sky, which had been a flat slate, suddenly bruised purple and black. The wind stopped, and the air grew heavy and static. A prairie thunderstorm. They hit fast and hard in this country. Caleb was up on the roof of Lena's house, replacing a few shingles that had rotted through. He saw the wall of rain coming across the plains, a gray curtain devouring the miles. "You best get down," Lena called from the yard, the wind whipping her hair across her face. "Almost done," Caleb shouted back. He hammered the last nail just as the sky opened up. The rain didn't fall. It was driven sideways like buckshot. It was freezing cold, turning instantly to sleet. Caleb scrambled down the ladder, slipping on the wet rungs. He hit the ground and ran for the porch. Lena held the door open. "Get in!" He tumbled inside, soaked to the skin in seconds. Lena slammed the door against the wind and threw the bolt. The room was dim, lit only by the gray light filtering through the rain-lashed windows. Caleb stood on the rug, water dripping from his hat, his coat heavy and dark with moisture. He was breathing hard from the exertion. Lena stood in front of him. She was breathless too, her chest rising and falling. The storm had brought a sudden, violent energy into the house. "You are soaked," she said. It came on fast. Caleb said. He took off his hat, water running down his face, tracing the line of his scar. He looked at her. She was close, too close. He could smell the soap on her skin, beneath the smell of the rain. Lena looked up at him. The house felt suddenly very small. The air between them was thick, heavy with the pressure of the storm and something else. She saw the way his wet shirt clung to his chest. She saw the dark intensity in his eyes. She remembered the touch of his hand on hers. She remembered the way he had carried her to bed. A heat rose in her, starting in her stomach and flushing up her neck. It was desire, sharp and sudden, but it was terrified desire. She had only known a man's touch as something to be endured or feared. She didn't know what to do with this wanting. Caleb saw the flush on her cheeks. He saw her pupils dilate. His body reacted instantly, a tightening in his gut. He wanted to reach out. He wanted to wipe the rain from his face and pull her against him. But he saw the fear there too, the shadow of Silas. He stepped back. The movement was small, but it broke the circuit. I should dry off," he said, his voice rough. Lena blinked, as if waking up. Yes, of course, I will get a towel." She turned and hurried to the cupboard, her hands shaking as she pulled out a rough cotton towel. She handed it to him without looking him in the eye. Night brought no relief. The storm intensified. Thunder rolled across the plains like artillery fire, shaking the floorboards. Lightning flashed, illuminating the room in stark, white bursts. Lena sat in the rocking chair by the stove, her arms wrapped around herself. Every crack of thunder made her jump. Flashback, the door slamming, the shout, the sound of a belt buckle hitting the floor. End flashback. Caleb sat at the table, cleaning his Winchester. He had taken it apart, oiling the springs and levers. It was something to do with his hands. He watched Lena out of the corner of his eye. He saw the way she flinched. He saw the terror in her eyes with every flash of light. It wasn't just the storm. It was the memory of noise and violence. A massive crack of thunder split the air directly overhead. The house groaned. Lena gave a sharp cry and slid from the chair to the floor, covering her head with her arms, curling into a ball. "No," she whimpered. "No, please." Caleb dropped the rag. He crossed the room in 3 strides. He didn't touch her immediately. He sat down on the floor beside her. He put his back against the wall and extended his legs. "Lena," he said. His voice was under the thunder, deep and steady. "You are safe. It is just noise. Lena was shaking, rocking back and forth. "I can't," she sobbed. "I can't take it." Caleb reached out and took her hand. His grip was firm, anchoring. "Come here." Lena looked at him, her eyes wide and wild. She hesitated, then scrambled toward him, moving on her knees. She collapsed against his side, burying her face in the damp flannel of his shirt. Caleb put his arm around her. He pulled her tight against his ribs. He could feel her heart hammering against him like a trapped bird. "Breathe," he murmured against her hair. "Just breathe. I have got you." He held her. He didn't stroke her hair or caress her back. He just held her, a solid, unmoving presence. He let her borrow his strength. Lena squeezed her eyes shut. She focused on the smell of him. Gun oil, rain, and warm skin. She focused on the steady rise and fall of his chest. Gradually, the terror began to recede, replaced by something else. Safety. She had never felt safe in a man's arms. Silas's embrace had always been possessive, a prelude to a demand. This was different. This was shelter. She shifted slightly, pressing closer. Her hand moved up his chest, clutching his shirt. She felt the hard muscle underneath. The sensation was dizzying. The warmth of him seemed to seep into her cold bones. A fierce, terrifying hunger woke up inside her. She wanted to crawl inside his skin. She wanted to stay here forever. Caleb felt her shift. He felt the soft weight of her breast against his side. He closed his eyes, his jaw tightening. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him. He was a man who had been alone for a long time. The scent of her, the heat of her, was intoxicating. He wanted to kiss the top of her head. He wanted to turn her face up to his, but he couldn't. Not now. Not when she was scared. Not when she was vulnerable. It would be taking advantage. It would be what Silas would have done. He tightened his grip on her shoulder, his fingers digging in slightly. It was a warning to himself, not her. Stay still, he thought. Just stay still. They sat there for an hour, tangled together on the floor while the storm raged outside. It was the most intimate moment of Lena's life. The thunder eventually rolled east, fading into a distant rumble. The rain slowed to a steady drummer on the roof. Lena lifted her head. Her neck was stiff. She realized where she was, curled against Caleb Ryder on her kitchen floor. She pulled back slowly. Caleb let his arm fall away instantly. They looked at each other. Lena's eyes were shining, her lips slightly parted. The air between them was so thick it was hard to breathe. She wanted to tell him. She wanted to say, "Don't go." She wanted to say, "I think I could love you." But the word stuck in her throat, shame mixed with the desire. What kind of woman was she? A widow of 6 months? Throwing herself at a drifter? Caleb saw the conflict in her face. He stood up, his movement stiff. He picked up his gun from the table and holstered it. "Storm's passed," he said. His voice was hoarse. "Yes," Lena whispered. She stood up too, wrapping her arms around herself, missing his warmth immediately. "I should get back to the livery," Caleb said. "Miller will be wondering if the roof blew off." He walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the latch. He didn't look back. "Good night, Lena. Good night, Caleb." He walked out into the wet, black night. Lena locked the door and leaned her forehead against the rough wood. The house was silent again. But now the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with the echo of his heartbeat, and the terrible, wonderful ache of a heart beginning to thaw. The summons came on a Tuesday, delivered by a boy who swept the floors at the Mercantile. Mr. Crow wished to see Mrs. Hart regarding a matter of urgency. The boy had not looked Lena in the eye when he delivered the message, scuffing his boot in the dirt of her front yard before running off as if the house itself were contagious. Lena dressed with the grim precision of a soldier preparing for a court-martial. She chose her best dress, the black wool one with a high collar that scraped her chin, and brushed her hair until it shone like polished obsidian. She would not go to Elias Crow looking like a beggar, even if that was exactly what she was becoming. The walk to town was a gauntlet of silence. The wind had stripped the last of the leaves from the cottonwoods. leaving them skeletal against the white sky. As she passed the livery, she saw Caleb in the corral, struggling with a roan mare that was showing the whites of its eyes. He saw her. She felt his gaze like a physical touch between her shoulder blades. But he did not wave. They had learned the rules of this game quickly. In public, they were strangers. In the dark, in the quiet of her kitchen, they were becoming something else entirely, something she was too terrified to name. The bell above the door of the mercantile jingled, a cheerful sound that made Lena's stomach turn. The store was empty of customers. Elias Crow stood at the back, near the entrance to his office, wiping his hands on a pristine white handkerchief. "Mrs. Hart," he said. His voice was smooth, cultured, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Please, come into the office. It is private." The office was a small, windowless room that smelled of dry paper, ink, and stale cigar smoke. A large oak desk dominated the space, covered in ledgers. Crow gestured for her to sit in the wooden chair opposite him. He remained standing for a moment, establishing his height, before settling into his leather chair. He opened a ledger, running a thick finger down a column of figures. "I have been reviewing the accounts, Lena," he began. "And I must say, I am concerned. I paid for the flour and the oil," Lena said, her back rigid. "This is not about the flour," Crow said softly. He closed the book. "This is about your future and your reputation." Lena said nothing. She gripped her reticule so tightly, her knuckles turned white. People talk. Lena, a town like Blackwood has nothing to do but work and talk, and lately, the talk has been distressing. "If you mean the rumors about Mr. Ryder helping me with repairs," Lena said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her knees. "Then they are just that, rumors. He is working for his pay, is he?" Crow raised an eyebrow. The eyebrow was gray and bushy, like a caterpillar, "because the talk is that he is at your house until all hours. That a man with a reputation for violence is finding comfort in the home of our late, beloved sheriff. He is fixing the roof," Lena said, "and the fence, things that have been broken for months." Crow leaned forward, clasping his hands on the desk. It looked like a gesture of prayer, but his eyes were predatory. "I am a man of the church. Lena, I have a duty to the moral standing of this community, and I have a duty to you, as Silas's widow. You are vulnerable. You are alone. It is natural that you might make errors in judgment." He paused, letting the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. "Your credit is extended as far as it can go. The bank is asking questions about the mortgage. Now, with these scandalous whispers, the church ladies are questioning whether we should be supporting a woman who, how did Mrs. Gable put it, who invites the wolf into the fold. What do you want?" "Mr. Crow?" Lena asked. She was tired of the dance. "I want to help you," Crow said, spreading his hands. "I want to save you from ruin. I am prepared to make you a generous offer." He pulled a document from a drawer and slid it across the desk. "I will buy the house and the land. I will pay off the mortgage entirely, and I will give you enough cash to purchase a ticket east, to St. Louis, perhaps, or Chicago. Somewhere you can start fresh. Somewhere no one knows your name or your history." Lena looked at the paper. It was a deed of sale. "And if I agree?" she asked. "If you agree." Crow smiled, showing teeth that looked too yellow in the dim light. "I will speak to the ladies. I will tell them that you are a grieving woman who was taken advantage of by a drifting criminal. I will restore your good name so that you may leave with your head high. And if I refuse—" Crow's smile did not waver, but his eyes went flat and hard. "Then I am afraid I cannot protect you. The mortgage will be called in. The store credit will be closed. And the town, well, the town does not take kindly to women who dishonor the memory of their heroes. You will be destitute, Lena, and you will be entirely alone." Lena stared at him. She saw the trap clearly now. He didn't care about her morality. He wanted the land, he wanted the house, and he wanted the satisfaction of bending her to his will, just as Silas had. She thought of the cold, drafty house. She thought of the leaks Caleb had fixed. She thought of the way the light hit the floorboards in the morning. It was a poor place, a sad place. But it was hers. It was the only place where she was learning to breathe again. No, she said. Crow blinked. I beg your pardon? I said no. Lena said. She stood up. Her legs were shaking, but she forced them to hold her. I will not sell. That house is my home, and I will not be chased out of it by gossip or by you. Crow stood slowly. His face flushed a dark, angry red. You are making a mistake, Mrs. Hart, a grave mistake. You think that drifter can save you? He is nothing. He is a violent animal who will bring you nothing but blood and misery. I will take my chances, Lena said. She turned and walked out of the office, through the empty store, and into the street. She felt Crow's eyes drilling into her back, hot and hateful. She felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the town pressing in on her from all sides. But beneath the fear, there was a spark of something new. Defiance. While Lena was fighting her battle in the mercantile, Caleb was facing his own tribunal in the middle of Main Street. He had just finished loading a wagon for the trip to the mining camp when Marshal Tom Avery stepped out of the barber shop. Avery was a tall man, thin as a rail, with a mustache that drooped over the corners of his mouth. He wasn't a bad man, Caleb reckoned, but he was a weak one. And weak men with badges were often the most dangerous kind. Ryder, Avery called out. Caleb paused, wiping his hands on a rag. Marshal? Avery walked over, hitching his gun belt up. He looked tired. I had a telegram this morning, from a lawman down in San Saba. Caleb's face remained impassive, a mask he had perfected over years of poker games and interrogations. Is that so? Seems there was a bit of trouble down there a few years back, Avery said, watching Caleb closely. A range war, some cattle rustling, 2 men dead in a dispute over water rights. Caleb said nothing. He threw the rag into the back of the wagon. The telegram says they are looking for a man named Caleb. Fits your description. Scar and all. Says he rode for the Double Bar Ranch. Says he was handy with a pistol. I have ridden for a lot of ranches, Caleb said evenly. And I have seen a lot of trouble. That doesn't mean I started it. Avery sighed. He took a pouch of tobacco from his pocket and began to roll a cigarette. I believe you. Ryder, you have kept your nose clean here. Mostly. That business with the drunks. Well, they had it coming, but that doesn't matter. He licked the paper and sealed the cigarette. Crow is pushing me, he said quietly. He wants you gone. He says you are a menace. And now, with this telegram, if anything happens in this town, anything at all, I'm going to have to look at you first. You understand? I understand, Caleb said. You are a scapegoat waiting to happen. Son, Avery said, lighting a match on his boot heel. And the widow Hart. She is a lightning rod. You two together, you are building a fire in a powder magazine. Caleb looked at the marshal. There was no malice in Avery's eyes, only a weary pragmatism. If I were you, Avery said, exhaling a plume of blue smoke, I would saddle that bay horse and ride north, before the snow closes the passes. Caleb watched the marshal walk away. The wind cut through his coat, chilling the sweat on his back. He knew Avery was right. Every day he stayed. He put a target on his back. And worse, he put a target on Lena. He looked toward the north edge of town, where the small house sat huddled against the prairie. He thought of the way Lena looked when she poured coffee, her hands steady but her eyes sad. He thought of the silence they shared, which was the only peace he had found in 10 years. To leave was to survive. It was what he had always done. But the thought of riding away, of leaving her to the wolves like Crow and the whispers of the church ladies, made his stomach twist with a sickness that had nothing to do with fear. That evening, the wind howled around the eaves of Lena's house like a lost soul demanding entry. Inside, the stove was hot, casting a small circle of warmth against the encroaching dark. Supper was simple, a stew made from potatoes, onions, and a piece of salt pork Caleb had bought, served with bread that was 2 days old. They ate at the small table, the candle flickering between them. For a long time, they spoke of safe things, Caleb talked about the roan mare and how she had finally taken the bit without fighting. Lena talked about the embroidery she was doing for Mrs. Miller, the only woman in town who still met her eyes, but the events of the day hung over them, heavy and undeniable. The silence that usually comforted them felt charged, pressurized. "Crow wants to buy the house," Lena said suddenly. She put her spoon down. She hadn't eaten much. Caleb looked up, his eyes dark in the shadow of his brow. "Did he offer a fair price?" "He offered me a ticket out of town," Lena said. "He said he would save my reputation if I left. He threatened to ruin me if I stayed." Caleb's hand tightened on his spoon until his knuckles turned white. "He is a small man with a big shadow," he growled. "He is right. Though, isn't he?" Lena asked. Her voice was thin. "I am ruined. The way they look at me. They look at you because they are small," Caleb said, "because they need someone to look down on to feel tall." "It is not just that," Lena whispered. She looked at the candle flame. "It is Silas." "They think I killed him. Did you?" Caleb asked. It was the first time he had asked it directly. The question hung in the air, stripping away the pretense. Lena looked at him. She saw no judgment in his face, only a desire for the truth. "He was charming, she said." Her voice was distant, as if she were telling a story about someone else. "When he first came to town, he was handsome, and he had that badge. He made me feel safe. My father had just passed, and I was so scared of being alone." She traced the grain of the wood on the table, but the charm was a coat he took off at the door. She continued. "He was jealous. He didn't like me talking to the store clerks. Then he didn't like me looking at them. Then he didn't like me leaving the house at all. He said it was because he loved me. He said God wanted a wife to be pure." She looked up, her eyes wet. "He used God like a whip. Caleb. He would quote scripture while he twisted my arm behind my back. He would pray for my soul while he locked me in the cellar." Caleb sat motionless, a statue carved from granite, but his eyes were burning. "That night," Lena said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "he was drunk. He was always meaner when he was drunk. He started shouting about the butcher. He said I had smiled at him. He grabbed me by the hair. He was dragging me to the stairs. He said he was going to teach me a lesson I would never forget." A tear spilled over and ran down her cheek. "I pushed him," she said. "I didn't think. I just wanted him to let go. I shoved him with everything I had." She closed her eyes, replaying the horror. "He fell. He hit his head, and I stood there. Caleb, I stood at the top of the stairs, and I watched him bleed. And I didn't run for the doctor. I didn't pray. I just waited. I waited until he stopped moving." She opened her eyes, staring into Caleb's. "I don't know if it was an accident. I don't know if I wanted him to die. And that is what eats me alive. That is why I can't sleep." The room was silent, save for the pop of the wood in the stove. Lena waited for him to look away, to see the monster she felt she was. Caleb didn't look away. He reached for the coffee pot and poured more into his cup. His hand was steady. "My brother's name was Jacob," he said. Lena blinked, the shift catching her off guard. "He was 19. Caleb said, "I was 22. We had a claim in the valley. Good water, grass up to your stirrups. A rancher named Sterling wanted it. He offered us money, but it was our land. Our father is buried there. So we said no." He took a sip of the black coffee. "One night, Sterling's men came. They didn't come to talk. They set fire to the barn. Jacob was inside, trying to get the horses out. I was in the cabin. I came out shooting." Caleb's voice went flat, detached. The smoke was thick. I couldn't see. I heard Jacob screaming. Then the roof came down. He looked at his hands, spread flat on the table. The scars on his knuckles stood out white against the tanned skin. "I tracked them," he said. "It took me 3 days. I found them in a saloon in Santa Fe. 2 of them. I didn't ask for the sheriff. I didn't ask for a judge. I walked in, and I put 2 bullets in each of them." He looked up at Lena. "The law called it murder. Said I didn't have proof they set the fire. Sterling had money, and money buys the law. So I ran. I have been running for 8 years. There is still a bounty in some counties. $500 for the man who killed Sterling's boys." He leaned forward slightly. "I don't know if what I did was justice or revenge. Lena, I don't know if God cares about the difference, but I know what it feels like to be pushed until you break. And I know that standing over a man who hurt you doesn't make you evil. It makes you human." The air in the kitchen felt thick, heavy with the weight of their confessions. They had stripped themselves bare. There were no more secrets, no more polite fictions. They were two people standing in the wreckage of their lives, looking at each other through the smoke. Lena looked at his face, the scar that marred his cheek, the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the mouth that was usually set in a hard line but was now softened by shared pain. She didn't see a killer. She saw a man who had carried a mountain of grief for a decade and had never let it turn him cruel. She reached out. It was a slow, tentative movement. Her hand trembled as it crossed the space between them. Her fingertips brushed the back of his hand, touching the rough, scarred skin of his knuckles. The contact was like a lightning strike. Caleb flinched, his muscles seizing. He looked down at her hand, pale and small against his weathered skin. His first instinct was to pull away. He was dangerous. He was a man with a bounty. He was the reason the town was turning on her. He would only hurt her. He started to withdraw his hand. "I shouldn't," he rasped. "No," Lena said. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly on the floor. She moved around the table. She didn't stop until she was standing right beside him. She looked down at him, her eyes wide and dark and terrified, but determined. "Everyone leaves," she whispered. "Everyone I have ever loved has either died or turned on me. Don't leave, Caleb, please." She stepped closer, her skirt brushing against his leg. "I am so lonely," she admitted, the words breaking on a sob. "I am so tired of being cold." Caleb looked up at her. He saw the desperation in her face, but he also saw the fire. He saw a woman who had survived hell and was still standing. He stood up. He towered over her, blocking the candlelight. "Lena," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I am not a good man. I have nothing to give you but trouble." "I don't want a good man," Lena said. "I want you." She reached up and cupped his face with both hands. Her palms were cool against his heated skin. She traced the line of his scar with her thumb. Caleb stopped breathing. He felt himself shattering. The walls he had built around himself, the walls of stoicism, of distance, of solitude, crumbled into dust. He made a low sound in his throat, a sound of surrender. He lowered his head. Their lips met. It wasn't like the kisses in the dime novels. It wasn't graceful or polite. It was a collision. It was frantic and clumsy and overwhelmed with grief. Lena clung to him, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck. She kissed him with all the words she hadn't been able to say. The fear, the relief, the anger, the need. Caleb's arms went around her, pulling her against him with a force that knocked the breath out of her. He held her as if she were the only solid thing in a world that was falling apart. He kissed her deeply, tasting the salt of her tears and the sweetness of her breath. The kiss broke, only for a second, so they could breathe. Their foreheads rested against each other. "Caleb," Lena whispered, her voice shaking. "I am here," he groaned. "I am here." He swept her up into his arms. It was the second time he had carried her, but this time she wasn't asleep. She wrapped her legs around his waist, burying her face in his neck. He carried her to the bed. The room spun around them. The night that followed was not a storm, but a sanctuary. Outside, the wind screamed and the world remained cruel. But in the narrow bed, under the patchwork quilt, there was a hushed, sacred tenderness. They touched each other with a reverence that bordered on worship. Caleb's calloused hands moved over her skin not to take, but to memorize. He traced the curve of her spine, the softness of her waist, treating her body like something precious that had been mishandled for too long. Lena wept, quietly, when he kissed the hollow of her throat. She wept because for the first time, a man's touch didn't hurt. It didn't demand, it asked. They made love slowly, eyes open, watching each other. It was an act of reclamation. They were reclaiming their bodies from the violence of the past. They were reclaiming their hearts from the numbness of survival. When the storm of sensation finally crested and broke, leaving them breathless and tangled in the sheets, they didn't pull apart. Caleb held her against his chest, his chin resting on the top of her head. Lena listened to the steady, strong beat of his heart and finally, felt warm. The morning sun was cruel. It streamed through the window without apology, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and the reality of what they had done. Lena woke first. She lay still, feeling the heavy weight of Caleb's arm across her waist. The fire in the stove had died down to embers. The room was cold again. Memory washed over her, bringing a complicated tide of emotions. There was a glowing, golden joy in the center of her chest. She felt alive, truly alive, for the first time in years. But wrapping around that joy was a cold vine of terror. She was a widow. He was a drifter with a shadowed past. The town already hated them. God. She didn't know what God thought, but she knew what the Reverend would say. Adulteress, harlot, sinner. She looked at Caleb's sleeping face. He looked younger in sleep. The tension eased from his jaw. She had doomed herself. She knew it. If this came out, and in Blackwood, everything came out, there would be no mercy. Caleb stirred. His eyes opened, instantly alert. The habit of a hunted man. He saw Lena watching him. For a moment, his eyes were soft. Then, the memory of the night returned, and with it, the guilt. He sat up, pulling the sheet away, exposing his scarred back to the cold air. He rubbed his face with his hands. "Lena," he said, his voice thick. Caleb turned to look at her. His face was pained. I took advantage. He said, you were vulnerable. I shouldn't have—" "Don't," Lena said sharply. She sat up, clutching the quilt to her chest. "Don't you dare say it was a mistake." Caleb looked at her helplessly. "Look at where we are. Lena, look at what I am. Avery warned me yesterday. He said I am a danger to you. And he was right. If I stay, if this continues, they will destroy you to get to me." "I don't care," Lena said. "You should care," Caleb said, his voice rising. "You have a life here. You have a home. I can saddle my horse and be gone in an hour. I can ride north. I can lead the trouble away from you." "Is that what you want?" Lena asked. Her voice was quiet, deadly calm. "Do you want to ride away?" Caleb looked at the door. He looked at his gun belt hanging on the chair. Then he looked back at Lena. He looked at her dark hair tumbling over her shoulders, her pale skin, the fierce light in her eyes. "No," he whispered. "God help me. No. I would rather cut off my hand than leave you." "Then stay," Lena said. "But the town, let them talk," Lena said. "Let them whisper. We will be careful. We will be discreet. But I will not go back to being alone. I won't do it." She reached out and took his hand. "We have each other, Caleb. That has to be enough." Caleb looked at their joined hands. He felt the trap closing around them. Crow, Avery, the past, the bounty. He knew, with a fatalistic certainty, that this would not end well. The world didn't let people like them be happy. But as he looked into Lena's eyes, he knew he couldn't leave. He was bound to her now, by blood and by love. "Okay," he said softly. He leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, lingering seal on their pact. "We will hide it," he said. "We will keep it a secret, a flame in a lantern." Lena nodded, resting her forehead against his. But outside, the wind was picking up again, rattling the shutters, searching for a crack to let the cold in. And the town of Blackwood was waking up, hungry for a sin to punish. The morning sun that rose over Blackwood was pale and watery, offering no heat to the frozen mud of the main street. But the chill in the air was nothing compared to the frost that had settled over the town's spirit. It had started with a curtain twitching. Mrs. Gable, whose house offered a view of the lane leading to Lena's shack, had been awake before dawn, nursing a toothache. She had seen the shadow detach itself from Lena's door. She had seen the tall, broad-shouldered silhouette of Caleb Ryder slip into the gray morning mist. She had seen him pause, look back at the house, and then stride away toward the livery. By the time the sun was high enough to cast shadows, the story had flown from Mrs. Gable's front porch to the church steps, and from there to the general store. It grew teeth as it traveled. It was no longer a shadow. It was a brazen parade. It was no longer a morning departure. It was the conclusion of a night of debauchery. Lena walked into town at 10 o'clock to deliver the finished embroidery to Mrs. Miller. She felt the change instantly. The silence that greeted her was not the usual awkward avoidance. It was sharp, pointed, and aggressive. Two men stood outside the saloon, leaning against the hitching post. One of them, a ranch hand with a face pitted by smallpox, spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the boardwalk as she passed. "There she goes," he said, his voice loud enough to carry, "the weeping widow. Although I hear she is done weeping." His companion snickered, a low, wet sound. "I reckon she found a way to dry her tears. Nothing like a killer to keep a bed warm, is there?" Lena kept her eyes forward, her spine rigid, her face burned. She clutched her basket until her fingers ached. She could feel their eyes on her hips, on her neck, stripping away her dignity with crude speculation. She reached Mrs. Miller's house, her heart hammering against her ribs. Mrs. Miller opened the door, but she did not invite Lena inside. Her face was pale, her eyes darting nervously toward the street. "Here is the money." "Lena." "Mrs." Miller said, pressing a few coins into Lena's hand. Her voice was a hushed whisper. "You best go, Mrs. Miller?" Lena asked, confused. "Is something wrong with the work?" "The work is fine," the older woman said, glancing over Lena's shoulder. "But I cannot have you here. Not today, Mr. Miller says. He says it is not right. He says we cannot be seen condoning open sin. Open sin." The words struck Lena like a physical blow. "Please, Mrs. Miller," Lena whispered. "I have done nothing wrong. Mrs. Miller looked at her with a mixture of pity and judgment. "You had a man in your house all night. Lena, a man who is not your husband. A man with blood on his hands. You can call it what you like. The town calls it what it is." She closed the door. The click of the latch was final. Lena turned and walked away, her vision blurred by tears of humiliation. She did not know where to go. To go home was to hide, and she was tired of hiding, but there was nowhere else. As she passed the mercantile, the boy who swept the floor stepped out. "Mr. Crow wants to see you," he mumbled, looking at his boots. "Now." Lena took a breath, steeling herself. She walked into the store. The air inside was thick with the smell of spices and judgment. Elias Crow was waiting for her, standing by the counter with his arms crossed over his chest. He looked like a vulture perched on a fence post. "Mrs. Hart," he said. "What do you want?" "Elias?" Lena asked. She did not use his title. She was past politeness. Crow's eyes narrowed slightly. "I see the shame has not humbled you yet. Perhaps you do not realize the gravity of your situation." "I realize that this town has nothing better to do than gossip," Lena said. "This is not gossip," Crow snapped. "This is fact. You are harboring a dangerous man. You are engaging in immoral behavior while living in a house that I practically own." He walked around the counter, encroaching on her space. He smelled of bay rum and stale cigar smoke. "Marshal Avery was here this morning," Crow said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "He is under a lot of pressure. Lena, the decent people of Blackwood are demanding he take action. There is talk of charges, solicitation, harboring a criminal, moral turpitude." Lena felt the blood drain from her face. "They cannot arrest me for having a guest. They can arrest you for anything if the town demands it," Crow said. "And they are demanding it." He took a step closer. Lena backed up until her heels hit the display of canned peaches. "However," Crow said, his voice turning oily, "I am a forgiving man. I believe in redemption. I can stop Avery. I can silence the church ladies." "How?" Lena asked, though she already knew the answer. "Publicly denounce him," Crow said, "Stand up in church this Sunday and say that he forced his way in. Say that you were afraid. Say that you want him gone. And sell me the house. Today. Sign the deed. You will leave town, of course. I will give you enough for the stagecoach and a fresh start." He reached out and took her hand. His palm was damp. He squeezed her fingers, his thumb rubbing over her knuckles in a way that made her skin crawl. "You need a protector. Lena, you have always needed a strong hand to guide you. Silas knew that. I know that. If you are nice to me, if you show me the proper gratitude, I can make sure you are taken care of." Lena looked at him. She looked at the greed in his eyes, the lust he barely bothered to hide. She realized, with a sudden, crystal clarity, that he was not trying to save her. He was trying to own her. He was exactly like Silas. To men like them, she was not a person. She was livestock. She was something to be broken, corralled, and used. Something inside her, a piece of steel she had forged in the fires of her marriage, snapped into place. "Let go of my hand," she said. Crow blinked, surprised by the ice in her tone. "I said, let go." He dropped her hand, stepping back with a scowl. "You are making a mistake." "No," Lena said. "The mistake was thinking I could ever find mercy in a man like you. I will not denounce him. I will not sell my home, and I will never, ever submit to you." Crow's face turned a mottled purple. "You will regret this," he hissed. "By tomorrow, you will be begging me to help you, and the price will be much higher." "I would rather starve," Lena said. She turned and walked out. She held her head high, ignoring the stares of the customers. She felt sick to her stomach, terrified of what was coming. But she also felt free. Night fell like a hammer blow. The wind howled around the small house, rattling the loose shutter that Caleb had fixed. Inside, Lena sat by the stove, her sewing in her lap, but her hands were idle. Caleb was not there. He was at the livery, working late to avoid causing more trouble, though they both knew the damage was done. Crash! The sound of shattering glass exploded in the room. A rock the size of a fist flew through the front window, spraying shards across the floor. Lena screamed, throwing her hands up to protect her face. A jagged piece of glass sliced across her left palm. She fell out of the chair, scrambling backward into the corner. The wind rushed in through the broken pane, carrying the freezing cold and the sound of running footsteps. She looked at the rock sitting on her rug. It was wrapped in a piece of paper. Trembling, she crawled forward. Blood dripped from her hand, staining the floorboards. She unwrapped the paper. One word was scrawled in charcoal, jagged and hateful. Harlot. The door burst open. Caleb stood there, his chest heaving, his gun already drawn. He had heard the crash from the street as he walked toward the house. "Lena!" he shouted. He saw her on the floor, the blood on her hand, the shattered window. His face changed. The worry vanished, replaced by a mask of pure, terrifying rage. His eyes went black. He holstered the gun and turned back toward the door, his movements sharp and lethal. "I am going to kill them," he said. His voice was a low growl, vibrating with violence. "I saw them running. I can catch them." "No!" Lena cried. She scrambled up, ignoring the pain in her hand. She ran to him and grabbed his arm. He was vibrating with tension, his muscles hard as iron. "Caleb, stop! You cannot! They threw a rock at you!" He snarled, looking down at her. "You are bleeding. If you go out there and hurt them, you give them exactly what they want," Lena begged, pulling on his sleeve. "Crow said you were a dangerous animal. If you shoot a town boy, they will hang you. And they will say I deserved everything." Caleb looked at the darkness outside. He wanted to tear the world apart. He wanted to make them pay for every tear she had cried. The old instinct, the gunman's instinct, screamed at him to finish it. But he looked at Lena. She was pale, terrified, her blood smearing on his coat sleeve. She wasn't asking him to fight. She was asking him to survive. He let out a breath that was half a roar. He slammed the door shut and threw the bolt. "Let me see your hand," he said roughly. He led her to the table. He found a clean rag and a bottle of whiskey. He poured the alcohol over the cut. Lena hissed in pain, tears springing to her eyes, but she didn't pull away. Caleb wrapped her hand with gentle precision. His own hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the effort of holding back his rage. "They won't stop. Lena," he said quietly. "This is just the start." "I know," she whispered. "Then we have to decide. Do we fight or do we run?" "I don't know," she said. "I just don't want to be alone." The decision was taken out of their hands the next morning. The sun was barely over the horizon when the sound of horses filled the street. Lena and Caleb were drinking coffee, the broken window stuffed with an old blanket. Caleb stood up and moved to the side of the window, peering out through a crack. "It is Avery," he said. And he brought friends. Marshal Tom Avery sat on his horse outside the gate. Behind him were 4 men, deputies, or just hired guns. It was hard to tell. They carried rifles resting on their saddles. "Ryder!" Avery shouted. "Come out! Keep your hands where I can see them!" Caleb looked at Lena. "Stay inside," he said. He opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. He did not wear his gun belt. He held his hands out to his sides, palms open. "Morning, Marshal," Caleb said. "You brought a lot of company for a social call." "This isn't social." "Ryder," Avery said. He looked uncomfortable, shifting in his saddle. "I got another telegram from the circuit judge." "Is that right?" Caleb asked. "Seems that warrant for the questioning in San Saba is more serious than we thought. They are saying it wasn't self-defense. They are saying it was cold-blooded murder." "We both know that is a lie," Caleb said calmly. "Crow bought that telegram just like he buys everything else in this town." "It doesn't matter what I know," Avery said, his voice hardening. "It matters what the paper says. I have a duty to uphold the law." He leaned forward, resting his hands on the saddle horn. "I am giving you a choice. Ryder, because I think you are a decent man who got a bad hand. You can pack your gear and ride out. Be gone by sundown. If you are still within the town limits when the sun hits the mountains, I will arrest you, and if you resist, these boys will shoot you down." "And Lena?" Caleb asked. "Mrs. Hart stays here," Avery said. "This is between you and the law. She has nothing to do with it. Crow will eat her alive if I leave." Caleb said. "That is not my business," Avery said. "Sundown. Ryder. Do not make me kill you." He turned his horse and rode away. The posse followed, casting dark looks at the house. Caleb stood on the porch for a long time. Then he turned and went back inside. Lena was standing by the stove. She had heard every word. "You have to go," she said. Her voice was dull, lifeless. Caleb looked at her. He saw the resignation in her eyes. She was already mourning him. She was already preparing to be abandoned. "I am not leaving you," he said. "You heard him. Caleb, if you stay, they will kill you, or they will lock you up and send you back to San Saba to hang. You can't fight the whole town. I can take you with me," Caleb said. Lena laughed, a bitter, jagged sound. "Where? Into the winter. I have no horse. I have no money. I would slow you down. You would be caught in a day." "So that is it?" Caleb asked, his voice rising. "You want me to just ride away? You want me to leave you to Crow? I want you to live," Lena shouted. Tears streamed down her face. "Go, Caleb, please! Just go, before I beg you to stay and get you killed." She turned her back on him, wrapping her arms around herself. Caleb stared at her back. He felt a tearing sensation in his chest. Every logical part of his brain told him she was right. He was a survivor. He knew when to cut his losses. He knew when to run. But then he looked at the room. He looked at the chair where she had sat while he fixed the roof. He looked at the bed where they had found solace. He looked at the woman who had looked at his scars and called them beautiful. He crossed the room in 2 strides. He grabbed her shoulders and spun her around. "No," he said. He gripped her arms, his fingers digging in. "I am not Silas," he said fiercely. "I am not going to own you, and I am not going to abandon you. We are in this together. You said you didn't want to be alone. Well, neither do I. But we can't stay, Lena sobbed. Then we leave, Caleb said. Together. We can't outrun them, Lena said. Not with a wagon, not with me. We don't run, Caleb said. We hide. He looked toward the window, toward the distant peaks. There is a line cabin, he said, up in the high foothills, about a day's ride north. It belongs to the Double O Ranch, but they don't use it in winter. It is rough, and it is cold, and it is hard to get to. Avery won't look there. He will think I headed for the border. Lena looked at him. She saw the desperation in his eyes, but also the determination. It will be hard. Lena, he said, it will be freezing. We might starve, but we will be together. Lena looked at the house. It was her prison. It was the place where her husband had beaten her and where the town had shamed her. She looked at Caleb. He was her risk. He was her danger. But he was also her only hope. Okay, she whispered. Okay, Caleb said. They moved with the frantic energy of the condemned. There was no time for sentimentality. Caleb went to the livery to get his horse and, using the last of his coin, bought a scrawny, stubborn pack mule from a stable hand who didn't ask questions. Lena packed her life into 2 canvas sacks. She took her warmest clothes, the wool dress, a heavy coat, thick stockings. She took the quilt from the bed. She took her sewing kit, knowing it was the only way she could make money if they ever found another town. She took her small Bible, not because she was sure God was listening, but because it had been her mother's. She left the furniture. She left the china plates. She left the ghosts of Silas and the life she was supposed to have. Dusk was falling when Caleb brought the horses to the back of the house. The sky was the color of a bruised plum. The wind was cutting like a knife, carrying the scent of snow. Lena stepped out onto the porch. She locked the door behind her, though she didn't know why. She dropped the key into the dirt. Caleb boosted her up onto his bay horse. The saddle was big and hard. I will walk for now, Caleb said, taking the reins. We need to save the horse's strength. He tied the mule's lead rope to the saddle horn. He looked up at her. Ready? He asked. No, Lena said honestly. But I am going. They moved out, sticking to the alleys in the shadows. They slipped out of Blackwood like ghosts, leaving the lights of the town behind them. The transition from town to wild was abrupt and brutal. As soon as they cleared the last fence, the landscape opened up around them, vast and indifferent. The ground was hard as iron, ringing under the horses' hooves. The streams they crossed were frozen solid, the ice cracking ominously under the weight of the animals. The wind was a constant physical assault. It tore at their clothes and stung their eyes. Lena huddled in the saddle, wrapped in the quilt, but the cold found every gap. They rode for hours in the dark. Caleb walked ahead, his head down, leading the horse through the scrub brush and dry creek beds. He navigated by the stars and by memory, moving with a relentless, driving pace. Wolves howled in the distance, a lonely, hungry sound that made the horse pin its ears back. Lena shivered, not just from the cold. She felt small. She felt like a speck of dust on the face of an uncaring world. It was well past midnight when the terrain began to rise. They climbed into the foothills, the path narrowing, the trees becoming thicker and darker. There, Caleb said, his voice raspy. Lena looked up, nestled against a rock face. Half buried in a drift of old snow was a cabin. It was small, made of rough logs, with a roof that sagged in the middle. They reached the door. Caleb lifted Lena down. Her legs were so numb she collapsed, and he had to catch her. Easy, he said. He held her up until she found her footing. He pushed the door open. It shrieked on rusted hinges. The inside smelled of dust, rat droppings, and old wood smoke. It was freezing, darker than the night outside. Stay here, Caleb said. He brought in the lantern and lit it. The light revealed a single room. There was a rusted stove in the corner, a table with 3 legs, and a wooden bunk built into the wall with a straw mattress that looked like a nest for vermin. It is not a palace, Caleb said grimly. It is better than a cell, Lena said, her teeth chattering. Survival took over. There was no time to rest. Caleb went back out into the dark to tend to the horses and chop wood from a fallen pine he had spotted. Lena found a broken broom in the corner and swept the rat droppings out the door. She found a stash of dry moss and leaves in a box and began to stuff them into the cracks between the logs where the wind whistled through. Caleb returned with an armful of wood. He built a fire in the stove, nursing the small flame until it caught the logs. The metal ticked and groaned as it heated up. Smoke leaked into the room before drafting up the chimney. But to Lena, it smelled like heaven. It smelled like heat. They worked in silence for an hour, securing their fortress. When the room was finally warm enough that they could see their breath only faintly, they collapsed. Caleb spread the bedroll and the quilt on the floor in front of the stove. The straw mattress was too filthy to risk. They sat down, leaning against each other, exhausted to the point of pain. "Here," Caleb said. He handed her a piece of dried beef and a canteen of water. They ate in silence, the firelight dancing on the rough walls. The wind screamed outside, trying to find them, but for now, they were safe. The isolation was total. There were no neighbors to spy, no Crow to threaten, no Avery to arrest. There was just the two of them, stripped of everything but their bodies and their breath. Caleb looked at Lena. Her face was dirty, her hair tangled, her eyes shadowed with fatigue. "We made it," he said softly. Lena looked at him. She reached out and touched his arm. "Thank you," she said. "For what? Dragging you into the wilderness? For choosing me," she said. The words hung in the air. Caleb turned to her. The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. He didn't say anything. He reached out and pulled her into his lap. She went willingly, wrapping her arms around his neck. She pressed her face into the crook of his shoulder, inhaling him. He smelled of pine sap and cold air and horse. This wasn't like the night in her bed. That had been desperate, a frantic clutching at life. This was different. This was a confirmation. Caleb ran his hands down her back, warming her. He pulled back slightly to look at her face. He scanned her eyes, searching for regret, for fear. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am freezing," Lena said, "and I am terrified, and I am tired. But I am not alone," she whispered. Caleb kissed her. It was a slow, deep kiss, tasting of smoke and promise. He laid her back on the blankets. He moved over her, his weight heavy and comforting. He paused, holding himself up on his elbows. "Tell me to stop," he said. "If you want to stop, tell me. I don't want to stop," Lena said. "I want you to make me forget the cold." They came together with a fierce, deliberate hunger. It was an act of defiance against the wind, against the town, against the emptiness of the landscape. Every touch was a claim. "I am here. You are here. We are alive." Lena clung to his shoulders, feeling the scars under his shirt. She pulled the shirt up, needing to feel his skin. Later, when the fire had burned down to glowing coals and the room was filled with a soft, orange light, they lay tangled together under the quilt. Lena traced the long, jagged scar on his ribs with her fingertip. "This one?" she asked softly. "Knife fight in Abilene," Caleb murmured. His eyes closed. "Drunk drover thought I cheated at cards. And this one?" She touched a round, puckered mark on his shoulder. "Bullet," he said. "That was the range war." She traced the scar on his face. "And this?" Caleb opened his eyes. He looked at her hand on his cheek. "Barbed wire," he said. "A horse spooked. I got caught in the fence. I was 16. He took her hand and kissed her palm, right over the bandage where the glass had cut her. "What about this one?" he asked. Lena looked at the bandage. "Blackwood," she said. "That is the mark Blackwood left on me. And this?" He touched a faint, old bruise on her upper arm. "Yellowing now. Silas," she whispered. Caleb kissed the bruise. "It is gone now," he said. "He can't touch you here." They lay in silence for a while, listening to the coyotes calling to each other in the dark. "Do you think we can survive?" Lena asked. Caleb pulled the quilt tighter around her. "I don't know," he admitted. "The winter will be hard. We have enough food for maybe 2 weeks. If the snow gets deep, We will be trapped. He paused. But I know a place. Further west. Over the pass. There is a valley. It is small, but the grass is good. No one claims it. If we can make it through the winter, we could go there. A valley? Lena asked. Just dirt and sky. Caleb said, but it would be ours. We could build a cabin, a real one, with windows that don't break. Lena closed her eyes, imagining it. A cabin in a valley, a garden, a life where she didn't have to hide. It sounds like a dream. She said, maybe, Caleb said, but dreams are all we have got right now. He kissed her forehead. Go to sleep, Lena. I will keep the fire going. Lena drifted off, her head on his chest, lulled by the rhythm of his breathing. Outside, the snow began to fall, piling up against the door, sealing them in. The land was indifferent to their struggle. It would freeze them if it could. But inside the small, drafty cabin, the fire held back the dark. And for the first time in her life, Lena Hart was not afraid of the morning. The flour sack was not just empty. It was a mockery. Lena shook it over the table, but only a fine white dust drifted down, settling into the cracks of the wood like snow. It was the 10th day in the line cabin, and the reality of their exile had settled in as hard as the frost on the window pane. We are out, Lena said, her voice flat. She folded the sack with careful, deliberate movements, smoothing the canvas as if neatness could conjure food. Caleb stood by the stove, feeding the last of the split pine into the firebox. He looked thinner. The sharp angles of his face were more pronounced, his cheekbones casting shadows that made his scar look like a canyon. He had been giving her the larger portion of the beans and the dried beef, claiming he wasn't hungry. But the way his eyes lingered on the empty skillet told a different story. The snow has stopped, Caleb said, looking toward the door. The wind has shifted to the south. The pass will be clear enough to ride. We have to go back, Lena said. It wasn't a question. Caleb nodded. We need supplies, coffee, ammunition, and we need to know what kind of rope they are twisting for us down there. They prepared for the journey with the grim efficiency of soldiers. They would not ride in together. That was too dangerous. A man and a woman on a pack mule and a horse were a target. Two strangers drifting in separately were just part of the landscape. I will take the mule and circle round the east ridge, Caleb instructed, checking the load in his Winchester. I will tie up behind the livery. You ride the bay. Go to Mrs. Miller's. If things are quiet, meet me at the blacksmith's shed at sundown. If they are not, he paused, looking at her. If they are not, Lena finished, touching his arm. You ride. You don't wait for me. Caleb's jaw tightened. I will wait, he said. Blackwood looked the same, and yet entirely different. To Lena, riding down the main street with her head lowered and her shawl pulled forward. The town felt like a stage set for a tragedy she already knew the ending to. The buildings leaned inward. The windows looked like judgmental eyes, and the mud seemed to want to swallow the horse's hooves. She tied the bay horse at the edge of Mrs. Miller's property, near the woodshed where it couldn't be easily seen from the road. She moved quickly to the back door and knocked 3 times, a soft, frantic rhythm. The door opened a crack. Mrs. Miller's face appeared, pale and drawn, surrounded by the gray wisps of her hair. When she saw Lena, her eyes widened in alarm, but she opened the door wide enough for Lena to slip inside. Child, you should not be here. Mrs. Miller whispered, locking the door and shooting the bolt. I had to come, Lena said, warming her frozen hands by the small kitchen stove. We are starving. Mrs. Miller, Mrs. Miller bustled to her pantry, her hands shaking. She pulled out a loaf of bread and a wedge of cheese, shoving them at Lena as if they were contraband. Eat, she said, quickly. Lena tore off a piece of bread, the taste of yeast and salt nearly making her weep. Mrs. Miller watched her, wringing her hands in her apron. The town is poison. Lena, the older woman said, her voice trembling. Crow has been stirring the pot every day since you left. He says you are a fallen woman living in sin with a murderer. He says you have abandoned your husband's memory to lay with a beast. Let him talk, Lena said, swallowing the bread. It is not just talk anymore. Mrs., Miller said. She pulled a chair out and sat down heavily. I heard them. Yesterday, I was sweeping the porch, and Crow was talking to Marshal Avery in the street. They didn't see me. What did they say? Lena asked, stopping mid-bite. Crow was shouting. He said Avery was too soft. He said if they could not catch the drifter, they should arrest you. Arrest me? For what? For moral indecency. Mrs., Miller whispered, her face flushing red. For harboring a fugitive. Crow said that if they put you in a cell, the drifter would come back. He wants to use you as bait. Lena felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. She lowered the bread. And Avery? She asked. He didn't want to do it. He said it wasn't right to lock up a woman. But Crow, Mrs. Miller looked down at her hands. Crow reminded him who pays for the marshal's office. He reminded him who holds the deed to Avery's own house. Lena closed her eyes. It was a web, and Crow sat in the center of it, pulling every strand. There is something else. Mrs., Miller said. Her voice was so quiet, Lena almost missed it. Lena opened her eyes. What? Mrs.? Miller looked up, tears standing in her eyes. I have carried a stone in my heart for 2 years, Lena, and I cannot carry it anymore. Not when I see what they are doing to you. She took a deep breath. I saw him. She said, Silas. Lena went very still. Saw him what? It was a Wednesday night 2 years ago. I was walking past the church to bring the Reverend some preserves. I heard shouting behind the woodpile. Mrs. Miller reached out and took Lena's hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. I saw him strike you. Lena, I saw him knock you to the ground. I saw him kick you. And I saw you curl up in the dirt and not make a sound. Lena stared at her. The memory of that night washed over her. The smell of the damp earth. The sharp pain in her ribs. The shame of being beaten in the shadow of the house of God. She had thought no one knew. She had prayed no one knew. You saw? Lena whispered. I saw Mrs. Miller nodded, tears spilling onto her cheeks. And Elias Crow saw it too. Crow? Lena's breath hitched. He came around the corner just as Silas walked away. He saw you lying there. He saw me standing there, Mrs. Miller squeezed Lena's hand. I started to go to you. Lena, I wanted to help, but Crow stepped in front of me. He looked at me with those cold eyes of his. He told me that what happens between a man and his wife is ordained by God. He told me that if I spread gossip about the sheriff, he would call in the loan on my husband's shop. He said I would be sleeping in the street by morning. She sobbed. A harsh, racking sound. I was a coward. Lena, I was afraid. So I walked away. I left you in the dirt, and I have hated myself every day since. Lena looked at the woman. She saw the guilt that had etched deep lines into Mrs. Miller's face. She realized then that she wasn't the only prisoner in Blackwood. Crow didn't just own the land. He owned the silence. It wasn't your fault, Lena said softly. It was Mrs. Miller insisted. But I am done being afraid. I am an old woman, and I have little left to lose. Lena stood up. Her fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. I need to find Caleb, she said. While Lena was learning the secrets of the past, Caleb was learning the dangers of the present. He had tied the mule in a thicket of scrub oak a mile out of town and walked in on foot. Keeping to the alleys behind the main street, he moved like a shadow, his boots making no sound on the frozen earth. He crouched behind a stack of barrels outside the rear door of the Silver Dollar Saloon. The voices inside were loud, but the voices outside were the ones that mattered. The back door opened, and 2 men stepped out into the cold. Caleb pressed himself flat against the wall, his hand hovering near the butt of his pistol. It was Crow and Marshal Avery. I'm telling you, Elias, this is going too far, Avery said. His voice was strained. Arresting the widow. The circuit judge will have my badge. The circuit judge is 3 days' ride away. Crow snapped. And by the time he gets here, the matter will be settled. She is a woman. Elias. She is a whore. Crow shouted, then lowered his voice. She is a contagion. Tom, she is defying the natural order. She is out there in the hills with that animal, laughing at us, laughing at you. Do you think the town respects a marshal who lets a killer walk away with the sheriff's wife? I didn't let him, Avery muttered. He ran, because you gave him a head start, Crow hissed. I know you warned him. Tom, do not think I am blind. There was a silence. Caleb could hear the strike of a match as Avery lit a cigarette. I want her in a cell by Sunday night, Crow said. If they are hiding in the hills, hunger will bring them down. When she shows her face. You take her. And Ryder? Avery asked. If he shows his face. You shoot him, Crow said. He is a fugitive resisting arrest. No one will question a dead man. The door opened and closed again as Crow went back inside. Avery stood there for a long moment, smoking in the cold. He kicked at the dirt, swore softly, and walked away. Caleb waited until the footsteps faded. He let out a breath he had been holding. His blood was boiling, a hot rage thrumming in his veins. They were going to hunt Lena like a rabid dog to get to him. He realized then that the line cabin was no sanctuary. It was just a slower way to die. If they stayed in the hills, they would starve or freeze. If they tried to run for the valley, Crow would send men after them. There was no running from this, not anymore. They met in the blacksmith's shed as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of red and purple. The forge was cold, the air smelling of iron and coal dust. Jeb, the blacksmith, a giant of a man with arms like tree trunks, stood watch at the door. He had nodded solemnly when Caleb slipped in, handing him a burlap sack of coffee without a word. Lena arrived 10 minutes later, slipping through the shadows. When she saw Caleb, she didn't run to him. She stood straight, her eyes bright with a strange, fierce light. We cannot go back to the cabin, she said. I know. Caleb said, I heard Crow. He is going to arrest you to draw me out. And I heard Mrs. Miller, Lena said. She told him what Mrs. Miller had said about the beating, the witness, the threats. Caleb listened, his face hardening into stone. So he has been protecting himself all along, he said quietly. Silas was his creature, and you were just property. We have to stop him. Caleb, Lena said, we can't just leave. If we leave, he wins. He keeps his power. He keeps hurting people. What do you want to do? Caleb asked. Sunday, Lena said. Sunday. The whole town will be at the church. She said, everyone. Crow sits in the front pew every week like a saint. He relies on their silence. He relies on their fear. She stepped closer to Caleb. I am going to speak, she said. I am going to stand up in front of God and everyone and tell them the truth. They will shout you down, Caleb warned. They will call you a liar. Let them, Lena said. Mrs. Miller said she is ready to speak, and if she speaks, maybe others will too. Caleb looked at Jeb, who was listening from the doorway. Crow cheated me on the iron shipment last month, the blacksmith rumbled, his voice deep as a drum, and he threatened to burn my shop if I told the freight company. Caleb looked back at Lena. He saw the fire in her. She wasn't the trembling woman he had found by the livery anymore. She was a force of nature. It is dangerous, Caleb said. If it goes wrong, we're dead anyway, Lena said. Caleb nodded slowly. A plan began to form in his mind. A desperate, reckless plan, but the only one that offered a future. I will be there, he said. No, Lena said. You can't come in. Avery will shoot you. I won't come in the front, Caleb said, and I won't come in alone. He looked at Jeb. Are there any hands in town from the Box T Ranch? Shorty and Red are at the saloon. Jeb said, they always liked you. Caleb, they didn't like how Crow treated you. Go get them, Caleb said. Tell them I am buying the next round, and tell them I have a story to tell about a telegram from San Saba that never existed. Sunday morning dawned crisp and brittle. The church bell tolled across the plains, a mournful sound that summoned the faithful. The church was a simple white structure, the paint peeling on the south side. Inside, it was packed. The air was thick with the smell of wool, damp coats, and kerosene lamps that flickered on the walls. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that cut through the windows. Liana walked in alone. The conversation died instantly. Heads turned, eyes widened. She walked down the center aisle, her boots clicking on the wooden floor. She wore her black dress, brushed and pressed. She did not look at the floor. She looked straight ahead. She took a seat in a pew near the middle. The space around her remained empty, as if she were surrounded by an invisible wall. In the front row, Elias Crow stiffened. He turned slightly, his eyes narrowing when he saw her. He whispered something to Marshal Avery, who sat beside him, looking miserable. The Reverend, a thin man with a voice like dry leaves, began the service. He spoke of sin. He spoke of the wickedness of the flesh. He spoke of the need to cast out the unclean things from the community. Every word felt like a stone thrown at Lena. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her knuckles white. She waited. And finally, "My brethren," the Reverend droned, "let us pray for those who have lost their way." Lena stood up. The movement was sudden, jarring in the stillness. The Reverend stopped mid-sentence. "Sit down. Mrs. Hart," Crow barked from the front row, not bothering to whisper. "No," Lena said. Her voice was thin at first, shaking with adrenaline. But she cleared her throat and spoke again, louder. "No, I will not sit down." A gasp rippled through the congregation. "You speak of sin, Reverend," Lena said, her voice gaining strength. "You speak of casting out the wicked, but you have the wicked sitting in the front pew." Silence. Absolute, terrified silence. "How dare you, Mrs. Gable hissed from across the aisle. "I dare because I have nothing left to lose," Lena said. She turned to face the room. She looked at the faces, the neighbors, the shopkeepers, the people who had watched her grow up. "You all whisper about me," she said. "You say I killed my husband. You say I'm a harlot because I didn't want to freeze to death alone." She pointed a trembling finger at the altar. Silas Hart was not a hero. He was a monster. He beat me. He beat me until I couldn't walk, and then he prayed over me while I bled. "Lies!" Crow shouted, standing up. He turned to the crowd, his face red. "She is hysterical. She is possessed. Marshal, remove her." "I saw it." The voice came from the back. "Mrs." Miller stood up. She was shaking so hard she had to hold on to the pew in front of her, but her voice was clear. "I saw it," she repeated. 2 years ago, behind this very church. Silas beat her like a dog, and Elias Crow saw it too. A murmur of shock ran through the room like a wave. "Mrs. Miller is senile," Crow yelled. "Do not listen to her. He threatened to take my home if I spoke. Mrs. Miller cried out. "He holds us all by the throat." The church was in chaos now. People were standing, shouting, arguing. The facade of Blackwood's decency was cracking. Then, a shadow fell over the open doorway at the back of the church. A silence swept from the back of the room to the front, like a wind dying down. Caleb Ryder stood in the doorframe. He leaned casually against the wood, his thumbs hooked in his belt. He was not wearing a coat. His gun was holstered at his hip. Behind him stood Jeb the blacksmith and 2 rough-looking cowhands, their arms crossed. "Marshal!" Crow screamed, pointing a finger that shook with rage. "Arrest him! He is a killer! He is here to murder us all!" Caleb didn't move. He spoke, his voice calm, carrying effortlessly to the rafters. "I'm not here to kill anyone," Caleb said, "unless they need killing." He walked forward, just a few steps. The crowd parted for him, shrinking away from the dangerous man. "I have seen a lot of bad towns," Caleb said. "I have seen towns run by gamblers and towns run by thieves, but I have never seen a town run by a hypocrite who hides behind a Bible." He looked at Avery. "Tell them about the telegram." "Marshal," Caleb said, "the one from San Saba." Avery stood up. He looked at Crow, then at Caleb, then at the floor. There wasn't a telegram from the judge. Avery mumbled. "What?" someone shouted. "Speak up." "Crow wrote it," Avery said, his voice miserable. "He told me to say it. He wanted Ryder gone so he could get the widow's land." The room exploded. The fracture was complete. The authority of Elias Crow shattered into 1,000 pieces. "You traitor!" Crow shrieked at Avery. "You incompetence!" Crow looked around. He saw the judgment in the eyes of the town. He saw the end of his reign. He looked at Lena, standing proud and defiant. He looked at Caleb, the man he couldn't break. Panic, primal and vicious, took over. Crow reached inside his coat. "He has a gun!" Jeb shouted. Crow pulled out a small, nickel-plated revolver. He wasn't aiming at Caleb. He pointed it wildly at Lena. "You witch!" he screamed. "You ruined everything!" "No!" Caleb roared. He moved faster than thought. He sprinted down the aisle. Crow fired. The shot went wide, missing Lena but shattering the glass chimney of an oil lamp mounted on the end of a pew. The lamp exploded. Burning oil sprayed across the dry, varnished wood of the floor and onto the hem of Mrs. Gable's dress. "Fire!" someone screamed. "Mrs." Gable shrieked, batting at her skirts. Men rushed to help her. Knocking over a bench, the fire caught the dry wood of the pews instantly. It raced up the wall, feeding on the dust and the old timber. Panic seized the crowd. The orderly service turned into a stampede. People surged toward the double doors, trampling hymnals, shoving each other. Lena was knocked sideways by a fleeing man. She hit the floor hard, the breath driven from her. Smoke began to fill the air, black and acrid. "Lena!" Caleb shouted. He couldn't see her through the press of bodies and the rising smoke. He fought his way forward, shoving men aside. "Out of my way!" Crow was still standing near the altar, paralyzed by the inferno he had started. He raised the gun again, aiming into the smoke, looking for a target. Marshal Avery lunged. He tackled Crow, slamming him against the altar railing. The gun went off again, crack, hitting the ceiling. They wrestled, rolling on the floor near the growing flames. Avery, younger and desperate to redeem himself, drove his fist into Crow's face. Crow went limp, sliding down the steps. Caleb found Lena. She was on her hands and knees, coughing, disoriented. He grabbed her, hoisting her up. "I have got you," he yelled over the roar of the fire. The heat was intense. The flames were licking at the ceiling now, curling toward the rafters. The varnish on the pews was blistering. "We have to get out," Lena choked. Caleb wrapped his arm around her waist. He looked at the main doors. They were jammed with people. "The side door," he shouted. "Behind the choir loft." He dragged her toward the small door at the front. The smoke was blinding. Caleb's eyes burned. He felt the heat searing the hair on his arms. He kicked the side door open. Cold air rushed in, feeding the fire behind them, but offering escape. They stumbled out into the snow, collapsing onto the frozen grass of the churchyard. Behind them, the windows of the church blew out with a crash. Flames roared into the sky, orange and hungry against the gray winter clouds. Caleb rolled over, gasping for air, wiping soot from his face. He sat up and pulled Lena into his lap. "Are you hit?" he asked frantically, checking her for blood. "Did he hit you?" "No," Lena sobbed. "I am okay. I am okay." She clutched his shirt, burying her face in his chest. She was shaking violently. "I thought I lost you," she cried. "I thought it was over." Caleb held her tight, rocking her back and forth. "I am here. I am not going anywhere." Around them, the townspeople were spilling out of the main doors, coughing, blackened by soot. They gathered in the yard, watching their church burn. They watched the flames consume the symbol of their community. And then, one by one, they turned to look at the two people on the grass. They saw the drifter, the dangerous animal, holding the widow. They saw the way she clung to him. They saw the raw, desperate love that bound them together, a love that had survived judgment, exile, and fire. They saw Elias Crow being dragged out by the marshal, his face bloody, his fine suit ruined. Silence fell over the crowd, heavier than the smoke. Lena looked up at Caleb. Her face was streaked with soot and tears. "I don't want to go back," she whispered, her voice fierce. "I don't want to go back to living half dead." Caleb smoothed the hair back from her forehead. His hand was trembling. "You won't," he promised. "We are alive. Lena, We are alive, and as the roof of the church collapsed with a thunderous crash, sending a pillar of sparks into the heavens, the town of Blackwood watched, and finally, for the first time, they understood. The smell of wet ash hung over Blackwood for a week. It was a heavy, cloying scent that seeped into the wool of coats and the timber of houses, a constant reminder of the Sunday when the town's facade of righteousness had gone up in flames. The church was gone. In its place stood a blackened skeleton of charred beams and a stone foundation filled with debris. The snow that fell in the days after the fire did not hide the scar. It only framed it in stark, white relief. The town was quiet. The usual bustle of the main street was subdued, men speaking in low voices as they passed the ruin. The saloons were somber. The judgment that had fueled the town's gossip for so long had been replaced by a stunned, uncomfortable reckoning. Elias Crow lay in his bed above the mercantile, his leg broken in the fall from the altar steps, his face bandaged where the fire had licked him. But his injuries were more than physical. His power, once absolute, had shattered the moment he pulled that trigger. The town had seen the monster behind the mask of piety. They had seen him willing to shoot a woman to keep his secrets. The rumors began to change. They no longer whispered about Lena's sins. Instead, Mrs. Miller stood on her porch, wrapped in a heavy shawl, and told anyone who would listen what she had seen behind the woodpile years ago. She told them of the bruises Lena had hidden. She told them of Crow's threats. It is not a curse. Mrs. Miller told the baker's wife. It was cruelty, and we let it happen because it was easier than speaking up. The image of the widow Hart as a temptress dissolved, replaced by the uncomfortable truth of a woman who had been fighting a war alone in her own home. Marshal Tom Avery sat in his office, the stove burning hot against the chill. His desk was covered in papers, ledgers he had seized from Crow's safe while the merchant was unconscious. Avery looked older. The lines around his eyes had deepened. He had spent years telling himself he was a peacekeeper, but the fire had shown him he was just a paid guard for a tyrant. He turned the page of a leather-bound book. It was all there. The fraudulent interest rates charged to the ranchers, the coercive terms on the loans given to families like the Millers, and a specific note, written in Crow's jagged hand, detailing a plan to pressure Lena Hart into insolvency to acquire her lot for a warehouse expansion. Avery closed the book. He felt sick. He lit a cigarette, his hand shaking slightly. He had nearly arrested an innocent woman. He had nearly shot a man who was only trying to save her. He stood up, grabbing his hat and coat. He had a job to do, a real job. This time, he found Caleb Ryder at the livery stable. Caleb was grooming the bay horse, his movements slow and methodical. He stopped when Avery entered, his hand resting near his hip. Though he wasn't wearing his gun belt, "Marshal," Caleb said. His voice was guarded. "Ryder." Avery nodded. He didn't rest his hand on his weapon. He kept his hands visible. "I have been going through Crow's papers. Is that right?" Avery took a breath. "There is no telegram from San Saba." "Ryder, you knew that. But now I have proof. Crow drafted a request for a warrant, but he never sent it. He just wanted you gone." Caleb stroked the horse's neck. "I figured as much." Avery scuffed his boot in the straw. "I have also been looking into the old trouble. The real trouble. I sent a wire to a friend of mine in Santa Fe. He checked the circuit records." Caleb went still, and it seems there were witnesses to that fire who finally spoke up after Sterling died last year. Avery said, "They say Sterling's boys lit the barn. They say you fired in defense of your brother. The bounty was dropped 6 months ago. News just travels slow to the territories." Caleb let out a breath he felt he had been holding for 8 years. The tension in his shoulders dropped an inch. "So I am free?" he asked. "You are free of the law," Avery said. "But this town—" Avery looked out the stable door toward the blackened ruins of the church. "Tensions are high. Ryder, people are ashamed. And when people are ashamed, they get angry. They need time to forget what they saw. They need time to rebuild." He looked back at Caleb. "If you stay, there will be trouble. Not from me, But someone will get drunk. Someone will say something. You will have to fight again. And I don't think you want to fight anymore. I don't, Caleb said quietly. I have a proposition, Avery said. He pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. Crow is in a bad way. He is facing charges for attempted murder, arson, and fraud. He is desperate to avoid a prison cell. I told him I might be able to speak to the judge on his behalf if he makes restitution. Avery held out the paper. This is a deed, he said. It is for a homestead over the pass, in the Shelter Valley. Crow bought it years ago for the water rights and let it go to seed. It is not much. It is wild country, but it is free and clear. Caleb took the paper. He unfolded it. It was a transfer of land, signed by Elias Crow with a shaky hand. He gives you the land, Avery said, and in exchange, you and Mrs. Hart leave Blackwood. You start fresh, somewhere nobody knows your names. Caleb looked at the deed. He looked at the marshal. You are asking me to run. He said, I am asking you to choose peace. Avery corrected. For her sake. Caleb nodded slowly. He folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket. We were leaving anyway, he said, but we will take the land. It is the lease Crow owes her. Lena sat in her kitchen. The room was half empty now. The boxes were packed. The house felt strange, like a shell she had already outgrown. She touched the wall near the window. She remembered the nights she had stood here, terrified of the dark. She remembered the way the house had felt like a coffin. Now, it was just wood and plaster. It held no power over her. The door opened and Caleb walked in. He brought the cold air with him, and something else, a sense of purpose. He placed the deed on the table. It is ours. He said, if we want it. Lena picked up the paper. She read the legal description of the land. 160 acres. Shelter Valley. Crow signed this? She asked. Avery made him. Caleb said, it is our way out. Lena, a place where we don't have to look over our shoulders. Lena looked at the paper, then at the room. It is hard land, Caleb warned. Avery said it has been neglected. It will be work from dawn to dark just to keep a roof over our heads. I am not afraid of work, Lena said. She looked at him. She saw the question in his eyes. He was offering her a life of hardship, of isolation, of struggle. He was offering her a future that was uncertain and dangerous, but he was offering it with an open hand. I went to the mercantile today, Lena said softly, to buy the last of the supplies. Did Crow say anything? Caleb asked. His eyes darkening. I didn't see Crow. I saw the clerk, young Timothy. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small cloth bag. He gave me this. He said it was on the house. He said he was sorry he never stopped Silas. He said he hoped I found happiness. She opened the bag. It was coffee, real coffee, not the chicory blend. And Mrs. Miller came by. Lena continued. She brought a jar of peach preserves. She hugged me. Caleb. She cried and she hugged me. She looked at the coffee beans. There is good in people, Lena said, even here. But I cannot stay. I cannot walk these streets and see the ghosts on every corner. She looked up at Caleb. I want to go, she said. I want to go to the valley. Caleb walked around the table. He stood before her, taking her hands in his. You are sure? He asked. Once we leave, there is no coming back. I don't want to come back, Lena said. That evening, the house was silent. The wind had died down, leaving a stillness that felt like a held breath. They had moved the mattress to the floor in the main room, close to the stove, having packed the bed frame for the wagon. The firelight cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. They sat on the mattress, wrapped in the quilt. They didn't talk much. The time for talking was done. Caleb reached out and touched Lena's hair. It was loose, falling over her shoulders in a dark curtain. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow, she echoed. She turned to him. In the dim light, his face was a landscape she was just beginning to learn. She traced the line of his jaw, the roughness of his stubble. I was always afraid, Lena whispered. With Silas? With the town? Even with you? At first, I was afraid of what would be taken from me. She moved closer, pressing her body against his. "I am not afraid tonight," she said. She kissed him. It was a slow, deliberate kiss. It wasn't the desperate collision of their first night, nor the frantic need of the cabin. It was a choice. It was a claim. "Make love to me." "Caleb," she said against his lips. "Not because we are scared, but because we are free." Caleb held her face in his hands. He looked at her with a reverence that made her heart ache. He looked at her not as a broken thing to be fixed, but as a whole woman who had chosen him. He lowered her back onto the mattress. The intimacy that followed was a conversation without words. It was an exploration. Caleb took his time, his hands moving over her with a gentleness that belied his strength. He memorized the curve of her hip, the pulse at her throat, the way her breath hitched when he touched the scar on her arm. Lena held him, feeling the weight of his body as an anchor. She traced the muscles of his back, the scars that told the story of his survival. She kissed them, one by one, sealing them with her acceptance. There were no ghosts in the room that night. There was no Silas. There was no crow. There was only the firelight, the smell of pine and skin, and the whispered promises that they would fight for each other, no matter how hard the land or the world became. Dawn was a blade of gray light cutting across the eastern horizon. The air was frigid, the kind of cold that freezes the breath in the throat. The wagon was loaded. It was an old buckboard Caleb had traded for, hitched to the sturdy bay horse and the mule. Lena stood on the porch one last time. She wore her heavy coat and a wool scarf wrapped around her head. She looked at the empty house. She left the door unlocked. Maybe someone else would find shelter there. Maybe the wind would claim it. It didn't matter. Caleb walked up the steps. He took her hand. "Ready?" he asked. Lena squeezed his hand. "Yes." She climbed onto the wagon seat. Caleb swung up beside her. He took the reins. "Walk on," he said to the team. The wagon creaked into motion. The wheels crunched on the frozen ruts of the road. They rode through the town of Blackwood. It was sleeping. The windows were dark. The ruins of the church were a black smudge against the gray sky. They didn't look back. They kept their eyes fixed on the distant mountains, where the pass cut through the stone like a gateway. As they cleared the edge of town, the sun broke the horizon. It flooded the plains with a pale, cold gold. The vastness of the west opened up before them, indifferent and beautiful and endless. The journey was brutal. The pass was treacherous, the trail narrow and slick with ice. The wind tore at them, screaming through the canyons. They camped that night under a canvas sheet strung between two boulders. A sudden late snow had begun to fall, large wet flakes that hissed when they hit the fire. They huddled together under the canvas, sharing their body heat. They were cold, they were exhausted, and every muscle ached. But as Lena watched the snow falling just inches from her face, she smiled. "What is it?" Caleb asked, rubbing warmth into her hands. "I was just thinking," Lena said. "I have never been this cold in my life, and I have never been this happy." Caleb kissed her temple. "Just wait," he said. "Just wait until we get home." They reached Shelter Valley 2 days later. It was a bowl of land tucked between high ridges, protected from the worst of the northern wind. A creek, frozen at the edges but running clear and fast in the center, cut through the middle. The homestead was a wreck. The cabin was little more than a lean-to. The logs rotted at the corners. The roof collapsed on one side. The fences were broken teeth jutting from the snow. The fields were choked with the gray skeletons of weeds. It looked hopeless. It looked like ruin. Caleb stopped the wagon. He looked at the devastation. He felt a twist of shame. He had brought her to this, to a pile of rotting wood in the middle of nowhere. "It is bad," he said heavily. Maybe we can keep going. Maybe we can find a town further west." Lena climbed down from the wagon. She walked through the knee-deep snow toward the cabin. She stepped inside the doorway, looking up at the patch of sky visible through the roof. She walked to the window frame, which had no glass. She looked out at the valley, at the creek, at the mountains rising like sentinels on all sides. She turned to Caleb, who had followed her, his hat in his hand. "The soil is deep," she said. "I can see it where the snow has drifted. It is rich. The roof is gone." "Lena," Caleb said. "We can fix it," she said. "The well is probably dry. We will dig it deeper." Caleb looked at her. She wasn't looking at the rot. She was looking at the future. She walked over to the corner of the room. "We can put the stove here," she said, gesturing. "And the bed over there, away from the draft. I can make curtains for this window, heavy ones, to keep the heat in. And maybe in the spring, we can build a porch, a place to sit and watch the sun go down." Caleb felt a lump in his throat. For 10 years, he had looked at buildings and seen only shelter or targets. Lena looked at a ruin and saw a home. "We can build a porch," he agreed, his voice rough. He walked over to the wall and tested a log. It was solid beneath the rot. "I can cut timber from the ridge," he said. "I can have the roof tight in a week." Lena smiled. It was a smile that reached her eyes, bright and undeniable. "Then we are home," she said. They worked until their hands were raw. They patched the roof with canvas and sod until Caleb could cut new shingles. They cleared the floor. They set up the stove. That night, the work was done for the day. The cabin was sealed, mostly. The fire was roaring. They went outside to bring in the last of the wood. The sky had cleared. It was a vast, terrifying dome of black velvet, pierced by 1,000,000,000 stars. There were no town lanterns to dim them. They blazed with a cold, white fire. The wind bit at their cheeks, but they stood there, wrapped in the shared blanket, leaning against the rough logs of their new home. Lena looked up at the Milky Way, a river of light spanning the heavens. "I will never forget it," she said quietly. "Forget what?" Caleb asked, his arm tight around her. "The fire," she said, "the way they looked at me, the way Silas looked at me." She turned her face into his coat. "Part of me will always be there. Caleb, part of me will always be that scared woman in the kitchen." "It is okay to remember," Caleb said. "The scars remind us that we survived." "I know," Lena said. She looked up at him. "But I am tired of the past writing my story. I want new memories. Caleb, I want to remember the smell of new wood. I want to remember the sound of the creek. I want to remember how it feels to cry because I am happy, not because I am broken." Caleb looked at her. He saw the strength in her jaw, the softness of her mouth. "I used to think I was a ghost," he said. "I thought I was meant to drift until a bullet found me. I thought that was my penance for the lives I took." He touched her cheek with his gloved hand. "But being here, with you, fixing this broken place, it feels like the first honest thing I have done." He looked at the valley, bathed in starlight. "Maybe justice isn't about punishment." He said, "Maybe it is about choosing something to fight for. And I choose this. I choose you." Lena turned in his arms. The wind whipped her hair across her face, but she didn't shiver. "Caleb," she said. He looked down at her. "I don't want to be alone," she said. The words echoed the first night they had met, but the fear was gone. It was no longer a plea for safety. It was a declaration. It was a demand for a witness to her life. "Not tonight," she whispered. "Not any night that is left to us." Caleb pulled her close. He wrapped her in his arms, a fortress against the cold. He held her like he would never let go, because he knew he never would. "I am here, Lena," he said, his voice anchored in the earth. "I am right here." They stood for a moment longer, two small figures in the vast, wild emptiness of the west. Then Caleb turned, and together they stepped back into the dim, warm light of the cabin. The wind howled down from the mountains, rattling the new shingles, searching for a way in. But the door was shut, the fire was lit, and in the heart of the winter, in a valley that appeared on no map, Lena Hart and Caleb Ryder began the long, hard work of living. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I don't want to be alone tonight. It has been a journey through the cold winds and warm hearts of the American West. I would love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Please leave a comment below and share your location. If you enjoyed this tale of survival and love, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories from the frontier. And don't forget to share your thoughts on Lena and Caleb's journey in the comments. Did they make the right choice? Thank you for your time. And until the next campfire,